The world outside the glass was losing its definition, dissolving slowly into a singular, bruised shade of indigo. It was not a sudden darkness, but a gradual thickening of the air, as if the sky itself were heavy with the weight of what was coming. Inside the small exchange building, the atmosphere was preserved in amber and shadow, a quiet sanctuary of wood and wire standing against the rising breath of the north. The room smelled of ozone, dry pine, and the faint, lingering scent of kerosene that had burned low in the lamp the night before. Here, the silence was not truly silent. It was a textured hum, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, born of the hundreds of miles of copper wire stretching out into the vast, freezing emptiness of the countryside. The wires sang in the wind, and that song traveled down the poles, through the insulators, into the brickwork, and settled in the floorboards beneath the operator's feet. She sat upon the tall stool, a wooden perch polished smooth by years of waiting. Her posture was upright, dictated by the rigidity of her corset and the discipline of her trade, but her shoulders carried the invisible burden of the barometric pressure dropping steadily, mile by mile. The switchboard loomed before her, a monolith of dark oak and bakelite, standing like a cliff face in the dim light. It was a vertical landscape of holes and jacks, a grid of potential conversations that were currently asleep. The brass fittings caught the weak light of the single lantern hanging to her left, gleaming with a dull, muffled gold that looked like a smudge of pastel chalk against the deep charcoal of the shadows. There was no sharpness in this room, only soft edges and deep, swallowing darkness. The visual quality of the moment was grainy, like a drawing made on rough paper, where the texture of the surface dictates the clarity of the image. Outside, the wind was beginning to test the structural integrity of the valley. It started as a whisper, a low sibilance passing through the needles of the pine trees that lined the road. Then it grew into a moan, a long, drawn-out exhalation that pressed against the windowpane with a physical hand. The glass rattled in its frame, a tiny, shivering sound that repeated with a hypnotic irregularity. Tack, 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 tack. The operator watched the window without truly seeing it. The pane was already glazing over with the first layer of frost, a creeping white lace that started in the corners and reached inward, consuming the view of the muddy road and the gray horizon. The frost looked like sketched lines, white pencil strokes layered aggressively over the dark blue of the twilight, obscuring the world, sealing her in. She reached out a hand, her fingers pale and slender, to adjust the headset that clamped over her hair. The heavy black receiver pressed against her ear, a cup of hard rubber that smelled of hair, oil, and static. Through it, she could hear the heartbeat of the county. It was a faint crackle, the sound of the lines swaying in the wind, brushing against wet branches, vibrating with the tension of the coming storm. There was no human voice yet, just the open line, the singing of the wires. It was a lonely sound, vast and hollow, like holding a seashell to one's ear, only to hear the ocean freezing solid. She adjusted the heavy woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The heat in the small cast-iron stove in the corner was fading, the coals glowing a deep, angry red beneath a layer of gray ash, but the warmth struggled to reach the center of the room. The cold was a living thing here. It seeped up through the gaps in the floorboards, rising from the frozen earth beneath the foundation. It drifted down from the uninsulated ceiling. It radiated from the switchboard itself, which felt cold to the touch, a massive block of winter brought indoors. The operator's eyes scanned the board. The signal lamps were dark, small unlit eyes waiting to blink open. Each lamp represented a farm, a doctor's office, a general store, a lonely house on a hill. When they slept, the board was a wall of black. When they woke, a small, pale light would glow behind the honeycomb glass cap, signaling a need, a question, a voice seeking another voice. But for now, there was only the waiting. This was the majority of the work, the endurance of time. The slow, rhythmic passing of seconds into minutes, minutes into hours, marked only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the deepening of the shadows. The clock was a round-faced regulator with Roman numerals drawn in severe black ink. Its pendulum swung with a heavy, lethargic rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound was loud in the small room, a metallic heartbeat that seemed to slow down as the temperature dropped. The operator watched the minute hand creep forward. It moved with agonizing slowness, a microscopic shift that felt like it took a lifetime. She picked up a pencil, the wood painted yellow but chipped to reveal the cedar beneath, and turned it over in her fingers. Over and over. The tactile sensation of the hexagonal ridges against her thumb was a grounding anchor. The room was dimming. The blue outside had deepened to a heavy slate gray, the color of a bruise, and the lantern light seemed to shrink, pulling its golden circle tighter around her and the board. She felt the draft brush against her ankles. It was a specific draft, one she knew well, the one that came from the north wall where the mortar had cracked years ago. It felt like a line of ice being drawn across her skin, even through the thick cotton of her stockings. She did not move to block it. She simply acknowledged it, a familiar ghost that haunted the exchange every winter. The sensation was part of the duty. To be here was to be cold. To be here was to be the fixed point in a swirling, chaotic world. The telephone exchange was the nerve center, and she was the keeper of the nerves. If the lines went down, the silence would be absolute. So she sat, and she froze, and she waited. On the desk ledge of the switchboard lay the logbook. Its pages were open, the paper coarse and yellowed, filled with the handwritten records of days past. Columns of times and numbers, notes on line quality, records of long-distance charges. Her own handwriting was neat, slanted, and repetitive. The ink was a faded blue-black, soaking into the fibers of the paper. She looked at the blank lines waiting for tonight's entries. They were empty horizons, vast stretches of nothingness that she would have to fill minute by minute. She dipped the pen into the inkwell, the glass clinking softly against the metal rim. The ink was thick, almost sluggish in the cold. She held the pen poised over the paper, watching a single drop form on the nib, a dark, glistening pearl of potential communication. It did not fall. She touched the nib to the paper and wrote the date. The scratch of the metal point on the paper was loud, like a skate cutting across ice. January 23rd. The loops of the numbers were precise. She wrote the time, 6:00 p.m., the start of the night watch, the start of the storm watch. The meteorologist's report earlier in the day, relayed by a crackling voice from the city miles and miles away, had been clinical and severe. A depression moving in from the plains, high winds, heavy snowfall, plummeting temperatures. They called it a blizzard, but the word felt too energetic for the slow, creeping paralysis she could feel accumulating outside. It wasn't rushing in. It was settling down like a heavy blanket of lead. She looked up from the book as the wind gusted again. This time, the building groaned. The timber frame, dried out by decades of seasons, shifted on its foundation. It was a mournful sound, the house complaining about the burden of the weather. The lantern flame flickered, dancing in the glass chimney, casting long, erratic shadows that leaped up the walls like silent phantoms. The shadows were soft, charcoal smudges that stretched and retracted, distorting the shapes of the filing cabinet and the coat rack. The coat rack stood in the corner, holding her heavy wool coat, which looked like a person standing in the dark, watching her. The coat was dark gray, heavy, smelling of damp wool and the outdoors. It hung limp, lifeless, waiting for her to inhabit it again when the shift was done. The operator reached out and touched the brass keys on the shelf before her, the listening keys. They were cold, biting the tips of her fingers. She flipped one forward and back just to feel the mechanical click, click, clack. It was a satisfying, solid sound. The mechanism was robust, built to outlast the storm, built to outlast her. The heavy cords, wrapped in braided cotton, some red, some green, some gray, hung in loops from the board like vines in a mechanical jungle. The weights beneath the console kept them taut, pulling them back into place when they were disconnected. She ran a finger down the length of one cord. The cotton was slightly frayed in spots, revealing the rubber insulation beneath. These cords carried the voices. They carried the news of births, of deaths, of grain prices, of gossip, of warnings. Right now, they carried nothing but the static of the atmosphere. She took a sip from the porcelain cup sitting near the logbook. The tea was lukewarm, bordering on cold. It tasted of tannin and tin. She swallowed it slowly, feeling the liquid move down her throat, a brief, faint trace of internal warmth that vanished almost instantly. She placed the cup back down, careful not to make a sound. The silence was precious. It was the canvas upon which the night would be painted. To break it unnecessarily felt like a transgression. Through the frosting window, the world had finally gone black. The indigo was gone, replaced by a void. The only evidence of the outside world was the sound. The wind was no longer just a gust. It was a constant pressure, a river of air flowing around the building, seeking entry. It whistled through the eaves, a high, thin note that harmonized with the hum of the wires. Woo-woo, woo-woo. It sounded like a flute played by a giant, breathless and melancholy. The operator imagined the telephone poles out there in the dark, standing like sentinels along the road. She knew them all by heart. The one by the creek that leaned slightly to the left. The one with the hawk's nest near the cross arm. The one where the insulation glass was chipped. They were out there, holding up the copper, standing knee-deep in the rising snow, enduring the lash of the wind so that she could sit here and watch for a light. The snow must be falling heavily now. She couldn't see it, but she could feel the change in the acoustic quality of the night. The world was becoming muffled. The sharp edges of the sound were being filed down, dampened by the accumulation of millions of snowflakes. The silence became thicker, more insulated. It was the sound of being buried. The snow was packing against the north wall, piling up against the foundation, sealing the cracks, turning the exchange into a cocoon. She imagined the flakes, distinct, geometric, perfect crystalline structures, falling by the billion, landing softly, interlocking, freezing together into a sheet of white iron. She checked the stove again from her seat. The glow was dimming. She would have to add coal soon. The scuttle was nearby, a heavy iron bucket filled with anthracite. The coal was shiny, black, and sharp-edged. It glittered in the gloom. The act of adding coal was a disruption, the noise of the shovel, the clang of the stove door, so she delayed it. She pulled her shawl tighter. She could wait. She was good at waiting. Her breath was not yet visible in the air, but it was close. The air in the room felt thin and crisp. It felt clean, sterilized by the cold. Suddenly, a light blinked. It was a small, silent explosion of white in the field of black holes. Third row, fifth column, the Miller farm. The light pulsed, a steady, rhythmic glow. On, off, on, off. The operator watched it for a second, mesmerizing in its insistence. It was the only movement in the room. Then instinct took over. Her hand moved without conscious thought. It was a fluid motion, practiced 10,000 times. She grasped the brass plug of the back cord, the answering cord, and lifted it. The weight of the cord was familiar. She guided the plug into the jack directly above the light. It slid in with a firm sensation of engagement. The metal sleeve of the plug made contact with the springs inside the jack. Connection. She flipped the listening key forward. The static in her ear changed pitch. It became louder, more chaotic, a swirling storm of electronic noise. "Number, please," she said. Her voice was low, flat, devoid of emotion. It was a voice designed to cut through the static, a voice of pure function. It was not a question, it was a prompt. Static hissed, a pop, then a voice distant and tinny, as if coming from the bottom of a well. "Sarah, is that you, Sarah?" It was Mrs. Miller. Her voice was thin, frayed with anxiety. "This is the operator," she replied, keeping her tone perfectly neutral. She did not use names. She was the machine. "Number, please." Oh, yes. Can you get me the doctor, Dr. Henderson? The snow is piling up against the door and the baby's cough has gotten deeper. I need to ask him about the steam." "One moment, please." The operator's hand moved again. She did not hurry. Haste led to mistakes. She located Dr. Henderson's jack, top row, far right. She took the front cord, the calling cord, and inserted it into the doctor's jack. Slide, click. She reached for the ringing crank on the side of the board. It was a polished wooden handle. She grasped it and turned. One long turn, two short. Whirr-ZZT, whirr-ZZT. The magneto generator hummed under her hand, sending a surge of electricity down the line, ringing the bell in the doctor's hallway 3 miles away. She waited. She left the listening key open, hearing the double ring in her headset. BRRR ring, BRRR ring. The sound was lonely. She could hear the wind howling on the Millers' end of the line, leaking through their drafty windows and into the transmitter. It harmonized with the wind outside her own window, a chorus of storms connected by wire. "Hello," a gruff voice, sleepy. "Dr. Henderson." "I have Mrs. Miller for you, doctor," the operator said. Her voice was the bridge. "Right, put her through." She flipped the key back to the center. The connection was made. The two voices were now joined in the dark, flowing through the board in front of her. She could no longer hear them, but she could see the supervisory lamps. They remained dark, meaning the lines were in use. When they hung up, the lights would glow, signaling her to disconnect. Until then, the cords formed a physical loop, a U-shape of braided cotton hanging against the face of the board, a temporary union in the freezing night. She settled back onto her stool. The silence rushed back in to fill the space left by her voice. The wind outside seemed to have noticed the activity and responded with a renewed gust, slamming against the south wall. The lantern swayed on its hook. The shadows tilted and swung. The temperature seemed to drop another degree. She looked at her hands resting in her lap. The skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim light. She rubbed her knuckles, feeling the bone beneath the skin. The cold was penetrating deeper now. It was moving past the sensation of skin and settling into the muscles. She looked at the window again. The frost had advanced. It now covered nearly half the pane, a thick, opaque curtain of ice. The patterns were intricate, ferns, feathers, jagged coastlines of white frozen onto the glass. They were beautiful and terrible. They blocked the view, but they also confirmed the reality. The world outside was becoming hostile to life. Only here in the small circle of the lantern was there a semblance of order. She picked up the pencil again. She opened the logbook. 6:15 p.m. Miller to Henderson, connected. She wrote slowly, carving the letters into the paper. The act of writing proved she was still awake, still functioning. The ink dried quickly in the dry air. She watched the sheen of the wet ink turn matte. The hum of the equipment was constant. MMMMMMMM. It was the sound of the voltage waiting. The batteries in the room next door, rows of glass jars filled with acid and lead plates, were the heart of the system. They bubbled silently, storing the energy needed to ring the bells to carry the voices. She could smell the faint, sharp tang of the acid mixing with the ozone. It was a chemical smell, industrial and harsh, contrasting with the natural scent of the freezing wood and the snow. She closed her eyes for a second just to listen. Without sight, the sounds became more distinct. The ticking clock, the rattling window, the groaning timber, the hissing wind, the hum. It was a symphony of isolation. She breathed in, feeling the cold air enter her nostrils, cooling the back of her throat, filling her lungs. She held the breath, then released it slowly. The exhalation was soundless. She opened her eyes. The room was the same. The shadows had not moved. The cords hung motionless. The lights were dark. She was the guardian of the quiet. She was the last voice in the storm, and the storm was only just beginning. The floorboards beneath the stove creaked as the metal contracted. A piece of coal shifted inside the firebox with a soft clink. The operator stared at the iron door of the stove. She knew she would have to feed it soon. The cold was a predator, circling the room looking for a weakness. It found it in the window frames, in the gap under the door, in the thin glass of the panes. It was a siege. The snow was the army, the wind was the artillery, and the cold was the infantry, infiltrating slowly, quietly, taking ground inch by inch. She adjusted the headset again, sliding the receiver slightly to ease the pressure on her ear. The static was a constant companion. It rose and fell like the tide. Sometimes it sounded like frying bacon, sometimes like rain on a tin roof, sometimes like a distant waterfall. It was the sound of the elements interfering with the works of man. The snow was charging the air with static electricity. The wires were picking it up, translating the weather into noise. She was listening to the sound of the snow falling. A deep thud echoed from the roof. A clump of snow, heavy and wet, sliding from the shingles and hitting the ground. Then silence again. The accumulation was building. The weight on the roof was increasing. The building settled under the load, groaning softly. The operator sat still as a statue. She did not fidget. She did not hum. She simply existed, a component of the machine made of flesh and bone but serving the copper and the current. She watched the board. She watched the dark honeycomb eyes. She waited for the light. She waited for the next voice to reach out from the white void, seeking a lifeline in the dark. The lantern flame dipped low, almost extinguishing, then flared back up, sending a pulse of warm orange light across the switchboard. For a second, the brass plugs glowed like embers. Then the shadows reclaimed them. The blue-gray darkness pressed in closer. The room felt smaller. The night felt longer. And the wind, endless and tireless, continued to carve its path around the small, defiant box of wood and wire. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The time was 6:22 p.m. The silence in the room had a texture, a graininess that seemed to thicken as the minutes stretched out. It was not an empty silence, but a heavy, suspended medium, like water just before it freezes. The air was still, yet it held a latent tension, a vibration that came from the walls, from the floor, from the very atmosphere compressed within the valley. The operator sat within this suspension, a figure drawn in soft charcoal lines against a background of deep, receding shadow. The lantern to her left continued its quiet vigil, the flame burning with a steady, low determination. It cast a pool of amber light that did not reach the corners of the room. Those corners belonged to the dark. They were deep pools of obscurity where the shapes of the furniture, the filing cabinet, the coat rack, the spare chair, lost their definitions and merged into a single, nebulous mass of gray and black. The clock on the wall offered the only rhythm: tick, a pause that felt too long, tock. The pendulum was a brass disc swinging through the gloom, catching a glint of the lantern light at the apex of each arc. It was a hypnotic motion back and forth, slicing time into digestible, identical segments. The sound was dry and mechanical, a stark contrast to the fluid, organic moaning of the wind outside. The wind had changed its voice. It was no longer whistling. It was thrumming, a deep, resonant bass note that vibrated against the exterior siding. It sounded like a heavy bow being drawn across the strings of a cello, low and mournful. The building absorbed this sound, transmitting it through the timber frame so that the operator felt it in her spine, a subtle trembling that merged with the cold. She shifted her weight on the stool. The wood was hard, unyielding. Her muscles, held in the same position for nearly an hour, were beginning to complain with a dull, aching stiffness. The cold had seeped through the layers of her clothing, the cotton undergarments, the wool skirt, the heavy knit shawl. It sat on her skin like a layer of fine dust, numbing the nerves. She flexed her fingers. They were pale, the knuckles slightly red from the chill. She rubbed them together, the dry skin making a rasping sound in the quiet. It was time. The stove needed attention. The thought formed slowly, rising through the lethargy of the cold like a bubble in thick oil. She placed her hands on the edge of the switchboard, pushing herself up. The movement was slow, deliberate. Her knees cracked, a sharp, organic sound that seemed shockingly loud. She stood, her boots settling onto the floorboards. The wood groaned under her weight. She stood there for a moment, steadying herself, feeling the blood move back into her legs. The room spun slightly, a trick of the low light and the fatigue, then settled. She turned away from the board, leaving the matrix of dark holes and silent lights behind her. The journey to the stove was only 5 steps, but in the heavy atmosphere of the room, it felt like a significant passage. She walked through the gradient of light, moving from the amber circle of the lantern into the cooler, bluer shadows of the corner. The air here was colder. The draft from the floor was stronger, swirling around her ankles, biting at the exposed skin above her boot tops. She could smell the iron of the stove before she reached it. A sharp, metallic scent mixed with the sulphurous tang of coal dust and the dry smell of ash. The stove stood on a square of galvanized metal, a black iron cylinder radiating a dying warmth. It was a pot-bellied beast, squat and solid, its surface pitted and textured by years of intense heat. Through the small mica window in the door, she could see the faint, pulsing glow of the bed of coals. It was a deep, angry red, barely visible beneath a suffocating layer of gray ash. The fire was suffocating. It needed air. It needed fuel. She reached for the poker, a rod of blackened steel hanging from a hook on the wall. The metal was cold to the touch, sucking the heat from her palm instantly. She gripped it firmly. With her other hand, she reached for the handle of the stove door. She wrapped a corner of her shawl around her hand to protect it, though the handle was likely not hot enough to burn. She turned the latch, screech. The metal hinges, dry and tight, protested the movement. The sound was harsh, scraping against the silence. She pulled the door open. A wave of heat rolled out, faint but palpable. It washed over her face, a momentary relief that made her skin tingle. The light from the open door spilled onto the floor, a fan of intense orange that cut through the blue shadows. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, tiny specks of matter swirling in the thermal current. Inside the firebox, the landscape was ruinous. The coals were a crumbling range of glowing peaks and ash-filled valleys. She inserted the poker, pushing it into the heart of the fire. She stirred gently. Crunch. Scrape. The ash fell away, dropping through the grate into the pan below. The red glow brightened, breathing in the fresh oxygen. The orange light on the floor intensified, flickering wildly as she disturbed the embers. She set the poker aside, the tip glowing a dull cherry red for a moment before fading to black. She picked up the coal scuttle. It was heavy, the bale handle digging into her fingers. She lifted it, the anthracite shifting inside with a sound like tumbling stones. She tilted the scuttle toward the open maw of the stove. She poured. One lump, two, then a small cascade. The coal hit the embers with a series of dull thuds. Thunk, thunk, clatter. The fresh fuel was black, shiny, reflecting the firelight like faceted obsidian. It sat atop the red bed, cold and dark, absorbing the heat. She lowered the scuttle and picked up the poker again, arranging the new coals to ensure airflow. It was a delicate architecture. Too packed and the fire would choke. Too loose and it would burn too fast. She built a small pyramid of black stones, leaving gaps for the draft to pull the flames upward. Satisfied, she withdrew the poker and closed the door. Clang. The latch clicked into place. The bright fan of orange light vanished, instantly replaced by the dim, blue-gray gloom. The room seemed darker than before, her eyes having adjusted to the brief brilliance of the fire. She stood by the stove for a moment longer, waiting. She could hear the fire begin to catch, a faint crackling sound, the roar of the draft pulling air through the vents. The cast iron ticked as it began to expand again. She held her hands out toward the black metal, palms open, trying to catch the radiated warmth. It was a subtle heat, struggling against the mass of cold air that filled the room. She turned slowly, letting the warmth touch her back, her shawl. It was a fleeting comfort. The cold was patient. It waited just inches away from the iron surface. She walked back to the stool. Her boots sounded heavy on the hollow floor. Thud, thud, thud. She settled back onto the perch, adjusting her skirts, pulling the shawl tight again. The brief excursion had circulated her blood, but the stillness was already reclaiming her. She looked at the switchboard. It had remained unchanged in her absence. No lights had blinked. No cords had moved. It was a monument to silence. She checked the window. The frost had advanced significantly. The clear glass was now almost entirely consumed by the crystalline growth. The patterns were thicker, layering over one another. What had been delicate ferns were now dense, opaque mats of white ice. The darkness outside was absolute. There was no moon, or if there was, it was buried behind miles of cloud and snow. The window was no longer a portal to the outside. It was a mirror reflecting the dim interior of the exchange. She could see the ghostly reflection of the lantern, a smudge of gold suspended in the white ice. She could see the vague outline of her own face, pale and indistinct, a specter watching her from the glass. The wind gusted again, harder this time. The building shuddered. A draft of air, incredibly cold, sliced through the room. It came from the ceiling this time, finding a gap in the attic hatch. It drifted down like invisible snow, settling on her hair, her shoulders. She shivered. It was an involuntary spasm that ran down her spine. The temperature was dropping. She glanced at the thermometer hanging on the pillar by the window. In the dim light, it was hard to read. She leaned forward, squinting. The red spirit in the tube was low, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and falling. The stove was fighting a losing battle. She reached for the headset which she had left on the desk ledge. The earpiece was cold against her ear. She adjusted the metal band over her head. The static greeted her. It was louder now. The snow was heavier. She could hear it in the line, a dense, fuzzy roaring sound that overlay the usual hum. It sounded like a million tiny feet marching on the wires. It was the sound of the storm walking across the country. She looked at the logbook. The ink from her last entry was perfectly dry. The paper looked brittle. She picked up the pen again just to have it in her hand. She felt the need to document the conditions, even if no one was asking. 6:45 p.m. Wind increasing. Heavy static on all lines. Temperature 50 inside. She wrote it in the margin, a small note for herself. The scratch of the pen was comforting. It was a mark of civilization, a proof of intellect in the face of the raw, mindless weather. As she set the pen down, a light flashed. Far left, bottom row, the trunk line, the connection to the main exchange in the city 40 miles away. It was a rare signal at this hour in a storm. Usually the city forgot about the valley until morning. The light blinked with a steady, officious rhythm. Blink, blink, blink. She plugged into the jack. Her movement was efficient, stripped of any wasted energy. She flipped the key. "Operator," she said. Her voice sounded loud in her own ears after the long silence. "Valley Exchange." The voice on the other end was male, clear but distant. It sounded clipped, professional, filtered through miles of copper and bad weather. It was the city dispatch. "This is Valley," she replied. "Line check," the voice said. "We're seeing fluctuations on the northern trunks. Heavy icing reported in Sector 4. How are your lines holding?" She looked at the board. The static was high, but the loop tests earlier had been clear. "Static is heavy," she said, "but I have no breaks yet. The hum is loud." "Copy that," the voice said. "Expect it to get worse. The front is stalling over the ridge. You're going to get the brunt of the accumulation. Engineering says the lines are heavy with ice already. If the wind picks up, we might lose the trunk." "I understand," she said. "If the trunk goes, you're on your own until the plow crews can get through. And that won't be tonight, maybe not tomorrow." "I understand," she repeated. There was no fear in her voice. It was a statement of fact. She was always on her own. The wire was just an illusion of proximity. "Keep the stove hot, Valley. Dispatch out." Click. The line went dead. She pulled the plug. The light went out. The conversation had lasted less than a minute, but it had altered the room. The isolation had been confirmed. It was no longer just a feeling, it was an official forecast. "You're on your own." The words hung in the cold air. She looked at the trunk line jack. It looked the same as the others, but now it felt fragile. A thin thread connecting her to the world of light and noise and heat. And it was heavy with ice. She imagined the wire stretching out from the building, going up the pole and running along the dark, snowy road. She saw it in her mind's eye, a black line coated in a thick white sleeve of ice, sagging between the poles. The wind whipping it back and forth. The ice cracking, then refreezing. The sheer weight of it pulling at the insulators, pulling at the wood. It was a miracle of physics that it held it all. She leaned back, the leather of the headset creaking. The wind outside rose in a crescendo, a long, tearing sound that seemed to rip the sky open. The window rattled violently. Tack, 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 tack. A dusting of snow hissed against the glass, sounding like sand. The draft from the floor intensified, wrapping around her ankles like cold water. She pulled her feet up onto the rung of the stool, curling herself into a smaller shape. She tucked her hands into the opposite sleeves of her shawl, creating a muff. She closed her eyes. The visual world vanished. leaving only the sound and the sensation. The smell of the coal smoke was stronger now, drifting from the stove. It was a dry, dusty smell. The heat from the stove was a weak pulse, reaching her in faint waves that were immediately swallowed by the chill. She focused on the static in her ear. It was a white noise ocean. If she listened closely, she could almost hear voices in it. Ghostly fragments of old conversations, echoes of words spoken years ago trapped in the wires. It was a trick of the mind, she knew, pareidolia of the ear. But in the dark, in the cold, the mind sought patterns. She heard a laugh, a sob, a shout, all composed of hiss and pop and crackle. She opened her eyes. The room was unchanged. The shadows were still long and deep. The lantern still burned. The clock still ticked. Tick, tock, 6:52 p.m. The night was young. The storm was young. The waiting was old. She stared at the wall opposite the switchboard. It was covered in beadboard paneling, painted a dark, glossy green that looked black in this light. There was a calendar hanging there, a picture of a summer meadow, cows grazing, green grass, blue sky. It looked alien. It looked like a window into another planet. She could not remember what warmth felt like. She could not remember the sensation of the sun on her skin. There was only the stove and the lantern and the cold. The numbness in her toes was beginning to tingle, a sign that the circulation was slowing. She wiggled them inside her boots. The leather was stiff and cold. She needed to keep the blood moving. She began a small, rhythmic movement of her feet, tapping her toes against the sole of the boot. Tap, tap, tap. It was a silent dance, a microscopic rebellion against the freezing. She looked at the lantern flame. It was a teardrop of fire, blue at the base, yellow in the middle, orange at the tip. It consumed the kerosene, turning liquid into light and heat. It was a simple chemical reaction, but here it was sacred. If the lantern went out, the darkness would be total. The switchboard lights were too dim to illuminate the room. She would be sitting in a void. She checked the oil level in the glass reservoir at the base of the lantern. It was half full, enough for the night. Probably. She took a deep breath. The air was sharp in her nose. She could feel the tiny hairs in her nostrils stiffening with the cold. She exhaled, and for the first time that night she saw it. A faint, ghostly plume of white mist escaping her lips, her breath. It hovered for a second in the lantern light, a delicate cloud of moisture, before dissipating into the dry air. It had happened. The freezing point had breached the room's defenses. The interior was now cold enough to turn breath into cloud. She watched her next breath. Another puff of white. It was mesmerizing. Evidence of life. Evidence of heat leaving the body. She was a furnace burning fuel to keep the core warm, exhausting the waste heat into the room. She watched the white clouds form and vanish. Inhale. Exhale, cloud, gone. Inhale, exhale, cloud, gone. It was a slow, rhythmic cycle, synchronized with the ticking of the clock. Tick, cloud, tock, gone. The wind moaned, a low, sorrowful sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The building creaked in sympathy. The wires hummed their electric song. The operator sat in the center of it all, a small, warm point in a vast, cold universe, watching her own breath fade into the shadows. The cloud of her breath was a transient sculpture, a phantom shape of white mist that formed in the air, held its form for a heartbeat, and then dissolved into the general atmosphere of the room. In the heavy, grainy light of the lantern, the breath looked like a smudge of white chalk rubbed against a sheet of dark gray paper. It was soft, diffuse, and silent. She watched it with a detached fascination, a clinical observer of her own biology yielding to the thermodynamics of the storm. The temperature inside the exchange had crossed a threshold. It was no longer simply a cold room. It was an environment that was actively extracting the heat from living things. The air was hungry. It pulled the warmth from her face, from her hands, from the small patch of skin exposed at her throat. She sat perfectly still, letting the rhythm of her breathing dictate the passage of time. Inhale. The cold air rushed in, sharp and dry, drying the membranes of her nose and throat. Pause. The exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, a silent chemical negotiation within the blood. Exhale. The warm, moist air rushed out, meeting the cold, condensing instantly into that delicate white plume. It was the only evidence of life in the still tableau of the room. If an observer were to look through the frosted glass, an impossibility, given the weather, they would see only the dark shape of the woman and the rhythmic puff of white, like the exhaust of a very slow, very quiet engine. The stillness of the room was heavy, layered with the dust of years. The exchange had stood here for decades, and the silence seemed to have soaked into the wood of the walls, the horsehair plaster, the heavy velvet curtains that hung uselessly by the door. The visual quality of the scene was low contrast, a study in deep blues and muddy browns. The lantern light did not so much illuminate the room as it did push the darkness back a few feet, creating a sphere of visibility that felt fragile and temporary. The light caught the texture of things, the rough grain of the floorboards, the smooth, dull sheen of the Bakelite switchboard, the scratchy fibers of her wool shawl. Everything looked worn, touched by 1,000 hands, eroded by the slow friction of daily use. Her eyes drifted down to the switchboard itself. It was a landscape of potentiality, currently dormant. The brass jacks were dark caves, hundreds of them arranged in a strict grid. Each hole was a portal to a different life, a different house, a different frozen room in the valley. The brass was tarnished in places, showing the patina of age. Around the jacks, the black material of the board was scratched and scuffed, marked by the frantic plugging and unplugging of cords during past emergencies, floods, fires, previous blizzards. But tonight the board was calm. The cords hung in their loops, heavy and limp. The cotton braiding on the cords was frayed in spots, revealing the rubber insulation beneath, which in turn hid the copper strands. Red cords, green cords, gray cords. They looked like dead vines hanging from a trellis in winter. She reached out a hand and touched the wooden shelf of the board. The oak was cold. It felt like touching stone. It sucked the heat from her fingertips instantly. She traced a groove in the wood, a deep scratch made by a pen knife or a frantic fingernail years ago. The sensation was grounding. The tactile feedback proved she was still here, still solid. The numbness in her fingers was growing, a creeping lack of sensation that started at the tips and worked its way toward the palm. She rubbed her thumb against the side of her index finger, feeling the dry, papery skin slide against itself. The sound was a faint whisper, swish, swish. The wind outside had found a new rhythm. It was no longer a constant roar, but a series of surging pulses. It would build slowly, a rising crescendo of pressure that pushed against the walls, making the timbers groan and pop. Then it would fade, leaving a vacuum of silence that was filled by the high-pitched singing of the wires. The wires were the choir of the storm. They vibrated in the wind, generating a tone that shifted with the wind speed and the tension of the ice load. It was a mournful, atonal song, a drone that resonated in the skull. Through her headset, the sound was amplified. It was a constant background texture, a tapestry of static and hum. Z-z-z-z-z-z-z-z-z-z-z, crackle, pop, z-z-z-z-z-z-z-z-z. She imagined the wires out there in the dark, miles of them, stretching from pole to pole, crossing frozen creeks, skirting the edges of snow-buried fields, climbing the hills toward the remote farms. They were thin threads of copper, vulnerable and exposed. She imagined the ice accumulating on them, a cylindrical sheath of white weight. The ice would be heavy, dragging the wires down, stretching the copper until it screamed. The poles, rooted in the frozen earth, would be leaning, groaning under the lateral force of the wind. It was a battle between the engineering of man and the physics of the atmosphere. And she was the witness, listening to the struggle through a piece of hard rubber pressed against her ear. The clock on the wall continued its dissection of eternity. Tick. The sound was crisp, metallic, indifferent. Tock. The pendulum swung through the shadows, a glint of brass in the gloom. The time was 7:12 p.m. Only 20 minutes had passed since the last check. It felt like hours. The distortion of time was a symptom of the isolation. Without the sun to mark the day, without the rhythm of voices to mark the social flow, time became a viscous fluid, pooling and stagnating. She watched the minute hand. It did not appear to move. It was frozen in place, trapped between the Roman numerals for 2 and 3. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes, it was still there. She looked away, forcing herself to focus on the corner of the room, counting to 10 in her head. When she looked back, the hand had moved perhaps a fraction of a millimeter. It was a test of patience. She shifted on the stool, the wood creaking beneath her. The discomfort was becoming a dull ache in her lower back, a stiffness in her hips. The corset she wore was a rigid cage, holding her upright, restricting her breathing. She felt the stays pressing against her ribs. It was part of the uniform, part of the discipline, but in the freezing cold it felt like armor. She adjusted her shawl, pulling it up over her head like a hood, creating a small pocket of warmer air around her face. The wool was scratchy against her cheek, smelling of lanolin and old closet dust. It muffled the sound of the room slightly, turning the wind into a distant rumble. Inside the hood of the shawl, the sound of her own breathing was louder. Inhale. She could hear the air rushing through her nostrils. Exhale. She could hear the soft wheeze of her lungs. It was an intimate, enclosed world. For a moment she closed her eyes and pretended she was somewhere else. Somewhere warm. A kitchen with a roaring stove, the smell of baking bread, the sun streaming through a clear window. The image was faint, washed out, like a watercolor left in the rain. It required energy to maintain, energy she did not have to spare. The cold dissolved the fantasy, bringing her back to the blue-gray reality of the exchange. She opened her eyes and looked at the window. The frost was now a thick, opaque barrier. The glass was entirely gone, replaced by a wall of white ice. The patterns had merged into a solid, textured surface. It looked like a topographic map of a glaciated continent. Ridges, valleys, plateaus of ice. The light from the lantern reflected off the crystals, creating tiny, sparkling points of light that looked like distant stars trapped in the glass. The wind buffeted the pane, and she could hear the dry hiss of snow hitting the other side. It was a granular sound, like sugar being poured onto a metal sheet. The snow was dry, hard, driven by the wind. It would be drifting now, piling up in great dunes against the leeward side of the buildings, burying fences, smoothing out the contours of the land until everything was a uniform, undulating white. She wondered about the depth. 6 inches, a foot, 2 feet. The report had said heavy accumulation. If it kept up all night, the road would be gone by morning. The exchange would be an island. She looked at the door. It was a heavy wooden door with a frosted glass panel in the upper half. The draft coming from beneath it was a tangible thing, a stream of freezing air that flowed across the floor like water. She could see the dust bunnies near the door trembling in the current. The air was invading. She remembered the tea. The cup sat on the ledge, a small white porcelain vessel with a chip in the rim. She reached for it. The handle was cold. She lifted it to her lips. The tea was stone cold. It was bitter, dark, and flat. She took a small sip just to wet her mouth. The liquid felt like ice water. It sent a shiver down her throat, a shock of cold to her stomach. She set the cup down carefully, making sure it didn't clatter. The sound of porcelain on wood was too sharp, too piercing for the quiet room. She picked up the pencil again. The yellow paint was peeling near the ferrule. She ran her thumb over the exposed cedar wood. It was soft, indented by the pressure of her grip over the months. She looked at the logbook. The page was a field of horizontal blue lines. The last entry was lonely at the top. 6:45 p.m., wind increasing. There was so much white space below it, a waiting void. She felt the urge to write something, anything, just to fill the space, to mark her presence. But there was nothing to report. The board was dark. The lines were holding. The status was unchanged. Status waiting, status freezing, status enduring. She tapped the eraser end of the pencil against the desk. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was dull, absorbed by the wood. She stopped. It was a waste of energy. The static in the headset surged. A sudden wave of white noise that sounded like a breaking wave. Crack sh. She reached for the volume dial on the side of the board and turned it down slightly. The noise was becoming aggressive. It was the sound of the atmosphere grinding against the earth. The snow was charged with electricity, triboelectric charging caused by the friction of the flakes colliding in the turbulent air. The wires were antennas, picking up the storm's electromagnetic scream. She listened deeper into the static. Beneath the roar, there was the hum. The 60-cycle hum of the power lines that ran parallel to the telephone lines in some sections. It was a low, steady B-flat. It was the sound of the city, miles away, bleeding into the local loop. It was a reminder that the grid still existed, that somewhere turbines were spinning, generators were turning, pushing electrons through the copper. But here, at the edge of the network, the pulse was weak. It was a dying echo. The lantern flame flickered violently, dancing in the chimney as a gust of wind pressurized the room. The light dimmed, casting the room into near darkness for a second, then flared back up, sending shadows leaping across the walls. The shadows were long, distorted shapes that stretched from the furniture to the ceiling. The coat rack looked like a skeletal tree. The filing cabinet looked like a tombstone. The operator's own shadow was projected against the side of the switchboard, a dark, hunched silhouette that mimicked her every move. She watched her shadow hand reach out to touch a shadow knob. It was a silent puppet show in the gloom. She pulled her hands back into the warmth of her shawl. She tucked them under her armpits, seeking the core heat of her body. Her fingers were stiff, the joints moving with a sluggish resistance. If a call came now, could she answer it? Could she manipulate the small brass plugs with the necessary dexterity? She flexed them inside the wool, willing the blood to flow. Open, close, open, close. The movement was slow, painful. The cold was settling into the bone. She looked at the stove. The red glow in the mica window was dim, a sullen, resentful eye staring back at her. The heat output had dropped. The initial burst from the fresh coal had faded, settling into a steady, low burn. It was not enough to combat the draft. She knew she should get up and shake the grate, open the damper, force the fire to roar. But the lethargy was heavy. The gravity in the room seemed to have increased. It pulled at her eyelids, at her shoulders, at her will. To move was to break the seal of stillness she had built around herself. To move was to admit that the cold was winning. So she sat. She stared at the signal lamps. They were small, round glass caps, milky white, set in brass bezels. They looked like pearls. If one were to light up, it would be a shock, a piercing white light in the blue dark. She found herself staring at the lamp for the sheriff's office. It was dark. No emergencies, no accidents, or perhaps accidents that were buried in the snow, unseen, unheard. The silence of the board did not mean safety. It only meant silence. The wind made a sound like a heavy canvas sheet flapping in the distance. Whap, whap, whap. Then a long, low moan that sounded almost human, a voice crying out in the waste. She stiffened, listening. Was it a voice? No, just the wind through the eaves, just the air moving over the sharp edge of the roof. But it had the cadence of a cry. She pressed the receiver tighter to her ear. Only static. The wires were indifferent. They did not care about the ghosts in the wind. She looked at the floorboards near her feet. They were wide planks of pine, darkened by oil and age. The gaps between them were black lines. Through those gaps the cold air rose. She could feel it on her ankles, a distinct layer of freezing temperature that sat on the floor like a ground fog. Her boots were leather, heavy and thick-soled, but the cold penetrated them. Her toes felt like pebbles inside the boots, hard, unconnected objects that she could wiggle but not fully feel. She began to count the holes in the switchboard, just a section of them. A block of 10 by 10, 100 holes, 100 potential conversations, 100 lives. She counted them visually, moving her eyes from left to right, top to bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a way to focus the mind, to keep the drift at bay. The drift was dangerous. The drift was the desire to close her eyes and just listen to the hum until she fell asleep. And sleeping was not allowed. Sleeping was dangerous. The fire would go out. The lines would go unanswered. The cold would take her. 98, 99, 100. The grid was perfect, symmetrical, orderly, an imposition of logic on a chaotic night. She took a deep breath. Inhale. The cold burned her sinuses. Exhale. The white cloud appeared, swirled, and vanished. 7:28 p.m. The night had barely begun. The darkness was still deepening, if that was possible. The blue tones of the room were shifting toward black. The lantern was a solitary island of light in a rising sea of shadow. She felt small. She felt finite. The building felt like a wooden ship navigating a frozen ocean, creaking and groaning as the waves of wind and snow crashed against it. And she was the helmsman, lashed to the wheel, steering into the white void, waiting for a signal that might never come. A sudden sharp crack echoed through the room. It came from the corner near the ceiling, a contraction of the wood, a nail popping, a beam settling. The sound was loud, like a pistol shot in a library. She jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared at the corner. Nothing moved, just the shadows swaying gently. The house was adjusting its bones. It was shrinking in the cold. Everything was shrinking. The metal, the wood, the flesh. Everything was pulling inward, trying to conserve itself. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A large, ragged cloud of mist. She forced her shoulders to drop. She forced her hands to unclench. It was just the house. It was just the cold. She looked back at the board. The static hissed. The lamps were dark. The world was asleep or buried. She was the watcher. She reached for the pencil again. She turned the page of the logbook, smoothing the paper down with a numb hand. The sound of the paper crinkling was loud. She wanted a fresh page, a clean slate for the next hour. The paper was rough, flecked with tiny imperfections. It smelled of pulp and dry storage. She stared at the blue lines, waiting for them to tell her what to write. But they were silent. Everything was silent except for the wind. The wind which never stopped. The wind which was the only true voice of the night. The atmosphere in the exchange had thickened, settling into a density that felt less like air and more like a heavy, transparent fluid. To move through, it required a conscious effort, a pushing against the weight of the silence and the cold. The operator remained seated on her high wooden stool, a figure composed of stillness and endurance, sketched into the gloom with heavy strokes of charcoal and slate gray. The lantern to her left had ceased to be a source of illumination and had become merely a reference point, a singular anchor of warm, dying orange in a sea of encroaching blue darkness. The light struggled to push past the edge of the switchboard, failing to reach the floorboards, leaving her boots submerged in a pool of shadow that looked as deep and cold as a cellar. The visual quality of the room was deteriorating with the falling temperature. The sharp lines of the filing cabinet and the door frame were blurring, softening into the grainy texture of the low light. It was as if the artist drawing this moment had switched to a softer pastel, smudging the edges with a thumb, blending the reality of the room into the dreamscape of the storm. The operator's eyes, heavy and dry, traced the grain of the wooden shelf before her. The oak was old, its pores filled with the dust of decades, sealed under layers of darkening varnish. In the amber light, the wood looked like the surface of a frozen lake, scarred by skates, deep and mysterious. She raised a hand to the headset, the movement slow and hydraulic, fighting the stiffness in her shoulder. The hard rubber cup of the receiver pressed against her ear, a physical pressure that had become a part of her anatomy. It was no longer an object. It was an extension of her skull, a prosthetic sense organ designed to perceive the electromagnetic weather. Through it, the storm was not just a wind. It was a roar of static, a chaotic symphony of crackles, pops, and a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated against her eardrum. Hiss. Pop, crackle, hiss. The sound was granular, like sand being poured onto a tin sheet. It was the sound of the snow hitting the wires miles away, the sound of the ice contracting, the sound of the wind rubbing the copper against the wet wood of the poles. She closed her eyes, letting the visual world dissolve, allowing the auditory landscape to take over. In the dark of her mind, she could see the network. It was a web of fragile lines stretched across the black, frozen valley. She saw the wires dipping low under the weight of the ice, swaying in the violent gusts. She saw the insulators, those small glass bells coated in rime, struggling to keep the current from leaking into the wet timber. She saw the poles standing like martyrs in the snowdrifts, shivering as the wind whipped past them. The entire system was under siege. The static in her ear was the report from the front lines. It was a distress signal from the infrastructure itself. A sudden sharp clack snapped her eyes open. It came from the board, a mechanical sound, metal hitting metal. She scanned the grid. A shutter had dropped. The small brass flap covering the annunciator for line 42 had fallen open, revealing the white number beneath. Line 42, the Ridge Road, the old Sawyer's Place, abandoned for the winter. She stared at the white number. It stood out in the field of black like a small, square moon. No one was there. The house was empty, boarded up since November. The line should be dead, but the shutter had dropped. The signal had been sent. Her hand moved, a reflex honed by years of repetition. She grasped the back cord, the cotton braid rough against her numb fingertips. She lifted the plug, the brass tip gleaming dull gold in the lantern light. She inserted it into the jack for line 42. Slide. Click. The connection was made. She flipped the listening key. "Operator," she said. Her voice was a whisper, a puff of steam that vanished instantly. There was no answer, only the wind, but this was a different wind. It was clearer, louder, whistling with a high, mournful pitch. Wee-yee-yee. It sounded like it was inside the room with her. She listened closer, pressing the receiver so tight it hurt. Underneath the whistle, she heard a rhythmic banging. Thump, thump, thump. She knew what it was. The wind had torn a branch loose, or perhaps a shutter on the old house had broken free. It was swinging in the gale, striking the side of the house, jarring the wall where the telephone was mounted. The vibration was tripping the mechanism, simulating a ring. It was the storm calling her. The wind was dialing the exchange. "Line testing," she whispered to the empty air. "No subscriber." She listened for a moment longer. The banging continued. Thump, thump. It was a lonely sound, a wooden heartbeat in an empty house miles away. She imagined the dark rooms of the abandoned farmhouse, the dust covers on the furniture, the cold accumulating in the corners, and that loose shutter banging against the siding in the blizzard. It was a ghost story told in sound effects. She flipped the key back. She pulled the plug. Click, slide. The cord retracted, the weight beneath the console pulling it down with a soft swish. She reached out and pushed the brass shutter back up until it latched. Snap. The white number 42 vanished, covered once again by the black metal. The board was silent again. The false alarm was cleared, but the feeling of it remained. The storm had reached out and touched the board. It was testing the perimeter. She rubbed her arms, the friction of her palms against the wool shawl creating a faint, dry, rasping sound. The cold was deeper now. It had moved past the skin, past the muscle, and was settling into the marrow. Her bones felt like rods of glass, brittle and cold. She wiggled her toes inside her boots. They responded sluggishly, distant and numb. The floor was a block of ice. The draft from the cracks between the boards was a steady upward current of freezing air, cooling her legs, stealing the heat from her skirts. She looked at the stove. The red eye was dim. The pile of coal she had added earlier had burned down, the volatile gases consumed, leaving only the glowing carbon hearts of the anthracite. They pulsed with a weak, deep red light buried under a new layer of gray ash. The heat output had dropped to a minimum. The room was losing the thermal battle. The thermometer on the wall was a blur in the shadows, but she didn't need to read it. She could feel the mercury contracting. She could feel the air turning solid. She knew she should get up. She knew she should take the shaker handle and agitate the grate, knocking the ash loose, opening the airway for the fire to breathe. She should add more coal. She should open the damper. But the lethargy was a heavy blanket. It was a seductive weight that pinned her to the stool. To move was to disrupt the equilibrium she had found. To move was to feel the cold air rush against her skin. To move required energy she was hoarding. So she waited. She negotiated with herself. 5 more minutes. When the minute hand touches the 6, then I will stoke the fire. She turned her gaze to the window. It was no longer a window. It was a wall of white geology. The frost had thickened into a crust, a dense, opaque layer of ice crystals that completely sealed the glass. The patterns were no longer delicate ferns. They were rugged mountain ranges, overlapping plates of armor, swirling vortexes of frozen moisture. The lantern light caught the facets of the crystals, creating a glittering field of microscopic diamonds. It was beautiful in a cold, hostile way. It was a barrier. The world outside was gone. There was no road, no trees, no town. There was only the white silence pressing against the glass. The wind buffeted the building, a sudden violent shove that made the timber frame complain. Creak. The sound came from the rafters, a long, drawn-out groan of wood under stress. The lantern swayed on its hook, the loop of wire squeaking against the metal ceiling plate. The shadows in the room lurched, swinging wildly across the floor and walls. The filing cabinet seemed to lean forward, the coat rack seemed to step closer. The room was animated by the wind's energy. The operator did not flinch. She was part of the room. She swayed slightly with the lantern, a subconscious alignment with the environment. She watched the shadows dance. They were soft, blurry shapes, lacking the sharp definition of daylight. They were like memories of objects fading in the gloom. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. They were pale, the veins showing as faint blue rivers under the translucent skin. Her fingernails were tinged with blue. She made a fist slowly. The skin felt tight like parchment. The tendons stood out, rigid and cold. She opened her hand. The movement was jerky. The fluidity of life was freezing up. She picked up the pencil again. It was a talisman, a tool of her trade. She held it by the eraser, letting the point hover over the logbook. The paper was yellow in the lantern light, the blue lines distinct and severe. 7:42 p.m. Line 42. False signal. Wind damage suspected. She wrote the words carefully. The P in PM was shaky. The W in wind was jagged. Her fine motor skills were degrading. The ink flowed onto the paper, dark and wet, and she watched it dry. It dried instantly in the arid, frozen air. The moisture was sucked out of the ink, leaving the pigment stranded on the surface of the paper. She stared at the entry. It was a record of a ghost, a record of the wind. In the morning, or whenever the relief came, they would read it and nod. Line 42 is down, they would say. Send the crew. But they wouldn't know what it sounded like. They wouldn't know the hollow thumping of the shutter in the blizzard. They wouldn't know the feeling of the empty house calling out in the dark. She placed the pencil down, aligning it perfectly parallel to the book. Order, structure. These were the defenses against the chaos of the storm. She reached for the volume knob on the side of the board again. The static was rising. It was becoming a roar. She turned the knob a fraction of an inch to the left. The noise receded slightly, but it was still there, a constant presence at the edge of her perception. It was the sound of the planet turning, the sound of the atmosphere dragging against the surface. She leaned back, the wood of the stool pressing into her spine. She felt the vibrations of the floorboards. The wind was playing the building like an instrument. The wires attached to the roof were the strings. The walls were the resonance chamber. She could feel the low-frequency hum in her teeth. It was a deep, droning B-flat that seemed to emanate from the center of the earth. Hum. It was hypnotic. It lulled the mind into a state of trance. She found herself staring at the grain of the floorboards, counting the knots in the wood. 1 dark swirl, 2 dark swirls, 3. They looked like eyes staring up from the darkness below. The floor was the only thing separating her from the frozen crawl space, from the earth that was hard as iron. She thought of the batteries in the room next door. The power room, rows of glass jars on wooden racks, lead plates suspended in sulfuric acid. They were the silent heart of the exchange. They sat in the dark, bubbling quietly, storing the chemical energy that allowed voices to travel through the ice. She should check them. She should check the specific gravity of the electrolyte. She should check the voltage. But the door to the battery room was in the shadows in the coldest part of the building. To go there would be an expedition. It would require the lantern. It would require leaving the switchboard. And she could not leave the board, not now. The storm was too loud. The potential for disaster was too high. Someone might call. Someone might be dying. Someone might be born. So she stayed. She trusted the chemistry. She trusted the lead and the acid to do their work in the dark. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, crossing her arms over her chest to preserve heat. She tucked her chin down, burying the lower half of her face in the scratchy wool. It smelled of wet sheep and dust, a comforting, organic smell in the sterile cold. She breathed into the wool, feeling the warmth of her own breath trapped against her skin. It was a small, personal microclimate. Inhale, the wool pressed against her mouth. Exhale, the wool warmed. She closed her eyes again. The darkness behind her eyelids was preferable to the dim, straining light of the room. In the dark, she could imagine the heat. She could imagine summer. She remembered the sound of crickets, the heavy, humid air of August, the smell of cut grass, the feeling of sweat trickling down her back. It seemed like a memory from a different life, a different species. How could the world be that hot and now be this cold? It was a paradox she could not resolve. The wind gusted, a long, tearing scream that went on for 10 seconds, 20 seconds. The building shook. The window rattled in a frenzy. Tack-tack, tack-tack, tack-tack. The frost on the glass seemed to vibrate. The lantern flame jumped, casting wild, flickering shadows that looked like frantic birds trapped in the room. The operator opened her eyes. She did not move. She waited for the building to collapse. She waited for the roof to tear off. She waited for the window to shatter inward, admitting the blizzard into the room. But the building held. The timbers groaned, flexed, and settled back. The wind receded, leaving the high-pitched singing of the wires in its wake. She let out a breath. A cloud of white mist exploded from her lips, swirling in the turbulent air of the room before vanishing. 7:55 p.m. The minute hand was approaching the top of the hour. The time for the check was coming. The time to stoke the fire was coming. She watched the clock face. It was the only face in the room. It was stern, impartial, judging her stillness. She prepared herself mentally for the movement. She mapped out the steps. Stand up, walk to the coal scuttle, lift the heavy iron bucket, open the stove door, pour, poke, close, return. It was a sequence of heavy lifting and thermal shock. She gathered her will, condensing it into a small, hard point in her mind. Just a few more minutes. Let the hour turn. Let the cycle complete. She stared at the signal lamps, the rows of sleeping eyes. They were dark, peaceful, indifferent. Beneath them, the cords hung in their loops, a silent waterfall of braided cotton. The red cords, the green cords, the gray cords, they were motionless. The room was a still life of winter. Woman at Switchboard, January 1928, drawn in charcoal and ice. The cold crept up her legs, past the tops of her boots, seeking the warmth of her blood. She felt it as a physical touch, a cold hand grasping her ankles. She did not pull away. There was nowhere to go. She simply sat and endured and watched the frost grow thicker on the glass. Tick, tock, tick, tock, the sound of time freezing solid. The minute hand of the regulator clock shuddered and fell forward, finally bridging the gap to the Roman numeral XII. It was a microscopic movement, a click of brass gears that was barely audible over the roaring of the wind. Yet in the landscape of the silent room, it felt like a heavy stone dropping into a deep well. The hour had turned. It was 8:00 p.m. The sound of the clock's internal mechanism engaging for the strike was a dry, rasping wheeze, followed by the tolling of the hour. Bong! The note was flat, dampened by the heavy air and the low temperature. Bong! It resonated in the timber of the walls, a vibration that traveled through the floorboards and up the legs of the stool. Bong! 8 times the hammer struck the coil, marking the passage of the shift into the true depths of the night. The operator listened to the decay of the final chime. It lingered in the room for a long time, a ghostly overtone that harmonized with the singing of the wires outside. The sound faded, but the obligation it signaled remained. It was time. The negotiation with her own lethargy was over. She could no longer defer the maintenance of the fire. To wait longer would be to risk the fire going out completely, a catastrophe that would turn the exchange into a tomb before morning. She uncrossed her arms, pulling her hands from the warm pockets of her armpits. The exposure was immediate. The air in the room bit at her fingertips, sharp and aggressive. She placed her hands on the edge of the switchboard to brace herself. The wood was colder than before. It felt lifeless, a slab of frozen material that absorbed her body heat without returning any sensation. She took a breath, steeling herself, and pushed. Her body unfolded slowly. Her knees, locked in the same angle for over an hour, protested with a dull, grinding stiffness. The heavy wool of her skirt rustled, a dry, whispery sound like dead leaves blowing across a pavement. She stood to her full height, swaying slightly as her circulation adjusted to the verticality. The blood rushed from her head, and the room dimmed for a second, the lantern light shrinking to a pinprick before expanding back to its dim, grainy normalcy. She stood there, holding the edge of the board, feeling the pins and needles of awakening nerves in her feet. The journey to the stove was a trudge through a swamp of cold air. Each step was heavy. Her boots struck the floor with a flat, wooden clomp that echoed in the emptiness. As she moved away from the switchboard, she moved away from the center of her world, leaving the grid of dark holes and the hum of the static behind. She entered the penumbra of the corner, where the shadows were deep blue and the air smelled of iron and ash. The stove waited. It was a dark, sullen presence. The red glow in the mica window was barely visible now, a dying ember in a cave. She reached for the shaker handle, a heavy iron lever protruding from the side of the ash pit. The metal was freezing. It burned her palm with the intensity of the cold. She gripped it with both hands, bracing her feet apart for leverage. She pushed. Grind, crunch, rattle. The sound was violent. The cast iron grates inside the firebox shifted, grinding against each other, crushing the clinkers and the accumulated ash. She pulled the handle back, then pushed again. Crunch. Rattle. A cloud of fine gray dust puffed out from the vents, swirling in the low light like a phantom. She could taste the ash in the air, a dry, chalky taste that coated the back of her throat. She shook the grate vigorously, forcing the dead waste to fall into the pan below, clearing the airways for the oxygen the fire so desperately needed. She let go of the handle. Her hands were trembling, partly from the exertion, partly from the cold metal. She reached for the door latch. She wrapped the hem of her apron around her hand this time, a thick layer of cotton to insulate her skin. She turned the latch and pulled. The door swung open, and for a brief, blinding moment, the room was transformed. The fire, though low, was still a source of intense, primal light. A wedge of deep orange and yellow illumination spilled out across the floor, cutting through the blue shadows like a blade. It hit the legs of the switchboard, the filing cabinet, the operator's boots, casting long, sharp shadows that stretched up the walls to the ceiling. The light was rich and textured, revealing the grain of the wood, the dust on the floor, the frayed threads of her skirt. It was a splash of warm pastel color on a dark canvas. A wave of heat rolled out of the open door. It hit her face with a physical impact. It was wonderful and painful at the same time. Her skin, numb and pale, prickled as the blood rushed to the surface. Her eyes watered in the sudden dryness. She leaned into it, closing her eyes, letting the infrared radiation soak into her front. For 5 seconds, she was not an operator, not a guardian of the wires. She was just a biological organism drinking in the energy of combustion. But the fire was hungry. The bed of coals was shallow, a landscape of glowing craters and black peaks. It needed fuel. She turned to the scuttle. She lifted the heavy bucket, the bale handle digging into her fingers. The coal shifted, a heavy, fluid mass of stone. She tilted the scuttle toward the orange mouth of the stove. Clatter, thud, hiss. The anthracite poured in. It covered the glowing embers, smothering the light. The orange fan on the floor flickered and dimmed as the fresh, cold fuel blocked the radiation. She poured until a mound of black, shiny stones rose in the center of the firebox. She set the scuttle down. Clang. She picked up the poker. She prodded the mound, spreading it out to ensure it caught evenly. The tips of the flames began to lick up through the gaps in the new coal, blue and yellow tongues tasting the fresh carbon. The coal began to crackle. Pop. Snap. The sound of thermal shock as the frozen stone met the fire. She watched it for a moment, mesmerized. The fire was the only living thing in the room besides herself. It breathed. It ate. It gave off heat. It was a companion, but she could not leave the door open. The draft was pulling the room's air into the firebox at a rapid rate. She was losing ambient heat to feed the stove. She closed the door. Clang, click. The light vanished. The brilliant orange wedge was instantly swallowed by the gray gloom. The room seemed twice as dark as before. The afterimage of the fire burned in her retinas, a ghost of warmth that faded slowly, leaving her standing in the cold shadow once again. She adjusted the damper on the chimney pipe, opening it slightly to increase the draft, to encourage the new coal to catch. The stove began to roar softly, a low, throaty rumble as the air rushed through it. Woo-woo. It sounded like the wind outside, but contained, controlled. She turned back to the room. The walk back to the stool felt colder than the walk to the stove. The brief exposure to the heat had made her skin sensitive again, stripping away the protective numbness. The draft from the floor felt like ice water on her ankles. She shivered, a violent tremor that shook her shoulders under the shawl. She sat down. The stool was hard. She adjusted her skirts, tucking them under her legs to create a seal against the draft. She pulled the shawl tight, reestablishing her cocoon. She picked up the headset and slid it over her hair. The receiver clamped onto her ear. The static was waiting for her. It hadn't paused. It hadn't noticed her absence. It was a continuous stream of chaos. Hiss, crackle, pop. She looked at the logbook. She needed to document the maintenance. It was part of the ritual, part of the proof that she was doing her job. 8:05 p.m., stoked fire, added coal, draft open. She wrote the words. The ink was dark and glossy for a second before the dry air drank the moisture. As she set the pen down, she noticed a change on the board. A light was on. It wasn't blinking. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of a subscriber turning the crank to call out. It was a steady, unblinking glow, a permanent signal. Line 18. The connection to the logging camp up in the North Gorge. The light burned with a steady, milk-white intensity behind the glass cap. It stared at her. A permanent signal usually meant one of two things. Someone had taken the receiver off the hook and left it there, or the line was down, grounded against the wet earth or a wet tree branch. Given the storm, she knew what it was. She plugged into the jack. Slide, click. She flipped the listening key. Operator, she said. Her voice was flat, expecting no answer. There was no answer, but there was also no static. The chaotic hiss of the storm was gone, replaced by a deep, heavy hum. MMMMMMMMMM. It was a clean, loud 60-cycle hum, the sound of the earth. The wire had snapped. It had fallen, likely weighted down by hundreds of pounds of ice, and was now lying on the ground or draped across a power line or buried in a snowdrift. The copper was touching the world. She listened to the hum. It was a mournful sound. It was the sound of a connection severed. The logging camp was now cut off. There were men up there, a caretaker and his family, wintering over. They were now an island in the white ocean. If they had an emergency, if the roof collapsed, if the fire went out, they could not call. They could crank the handle on their wall phone until their arms ached, but the signal would just drain into the snow. "Line 18, she asked again softly. "Are you there?" The hum droned on. Indifferent, the wire was dead. She flipped the key back. She didn't pull the plug immediately. She watched the light. It continued to glow, a silent alarm that no one could hear but her. She had to extinguish it. She couldn't leave the light on. It would burn out the bulb, and it was a distraction. She reached into the drawer beneath the keyboard shelf and pulled out a small brass sleeve, a trouble cap. It was a small metal cover designed to fit over the lamp. She placed it over the glowing light of line 18. The white eye vanished, covered by the dark brass. The light was still burning beneath it, but it was masked. A casualty of the storm, draped in a shroud. She picked up the pen. 8:10 p.m. Line 18, permanent signal grounded, no response. Line presumed down. She wrote it in the log. The first casualty of the night. The first retraction of the network. The world was getting smaller. The reach of her voice was shrinking. She looked at the other lamps. They were dark. How many of them were actually working? How many wires were stretched to the breaking point right now, singing their final song before the ice snapped them? She had no way of knowing until someone tried to call, or until the wire hit the ground and lit the lamp. The wind outside seemed to celebrate the victory. It gusted with a renewed fury, slamming against the north wall with a force that made the picture frames rattle. The lantern swung on its hook, casting the shadows into a frenzy. The coat on the rack seemed to flail its arms. The darkness in the corners seemed to surge forward. The operator felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the chill of contraction. The valley was closing in. The roads were gone. The wires were falling. She was sitting in a shrinking box, and the storm was piling the snow higher and higher against the walls. She reached for the volume knob and turned it up slightly. She wanted to hear the static again. She needed to hear the noise of the surviving lines. The silence of line 18 was too heavy. The static returned, a comforting roar of white noise. S-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H. It was the sound of the struggle. As long as there was static, there was continuity. She leaned back, her spine pressing against the wooden rungs of the stool. She felt the heat from the stove beginning to dissipate, the cold reclaiming the air with aggressive speed. The warmth she had felt standing in front of the open door was already a fading memory. The draft was back, winding around her legs. She stared at the covered lamp of line 18. It was a dark spot on the board, a blind spot. She imagined the wire lying in the snow, winding through the trees like a dead snake. The snow would cover it soon. It would be buried until spring. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The clock moved on. 8:15 p.m. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind. It had a rhythm now, a cyclical pulsing. Push, release, push, release. It was like the breathing of a giant animal. The building was the ribcage, expanding and contracting with the pressure. She was the heart, beating slowly in the center. She thought of the caretaker at the logging camp. Did he know the line was dead? Did he pick up the receiver and listen to the silence? Or was he asleep, unaware that his lifeline had been cut? She hoped he was asleep. She hoped he was warm. She rubbed her temples. The headache was starting. A dull throb behind the eyes brought on by the low light, the eye strain, the smell of kerosene and coal smoke. It was a familiar pain, a companion of the night shift. She took a deep breath. Inhale. The air was still sharp, still cold. The stove hadn't changed the fundamental reality of the room yet. Exhale. The white cloud appeared, thinner this time, but still there. She was tired. The heaviness in her limbs was increasing. The temptation to rest her head on the switchboard shelf was strong, just for a minute, just to close her eyes and rest her neck, but she couldn't. The board required vigilance. The lights were tricky. They could blink and vanish. She had to watch. She fixed her eyes on the darkness of the window. The frost was now a solid gray sheet, reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. It was a wall. "I am here," she whispered to the room. "I am watching." The sound of her own voice was small, swallowed instantly by the hum and the wind. But she said it anyway, a declaration of existence. The stove ticked as the metal expanded. The fire was catching. The heat would come eventually. But for now, there was only the weight and the growing list of things that were broken. The brass cap covering the signal lamp for line 18 was a small, dark eclipse in the field of the switchboard. It was a physical manifestation of silence. A metal eyelid closed over a blinding eye. The operator sat and watched it, her gaze unfocused, drifting through the surface of the board and into the imaginary landscape of the North Gorge. She could see the wire down in the snow, a black snake dormant in the white powder. She could see the trees standing vigil over the break, their branches heavy with ice, bowing low in the darkness. The connection was severed, and with it, a piece of the world had fallen away, sliding off the map into the void of the unmonitored storm. The room felt smaller because of it. The reach of the exchange had contracted. The circle of light was shrinking. The silence in the room was now textured by the memory of the hum that had come from the dead line. That deep, 60-cycle drone of the earth seemed to linger in the operator's ears, a phantom frequency beneath the static. She adjusted the headset, pressing the receiver against her head until the hard rubber dug into her skin. She needed the white noise. She needed the chaotic hiss of the living lines to wash away the heavy, mournful tone of the dead one. Shh, crackle, pop. The static was there, a faithful companion. It was the sound of the snow falling on the rest of the county, the sound of the wind rubbing against the wires that still held. It was a chaotic, messy sound, but it was alive. She took a slow breath. The air in the room was still freezing. The stove, despite the fresh coal and the open damper, was struggling to push the heat beyond the immediate radius of the hearth. The cold had mass. It had inertia. It occupied the corners of the room like a physical substance, a heavy, invisible gas that displaced the warmth. She could feel it pressing against her back, against the wool of her shawl. It was a patient pressure, the weight of the winter night leaning against the thin wooden walls of the station. The operator looked at the clock, 8:25 p.m. The night was moving with the speed of a glacier. Time was not flowing, it was calving, breaking off in large, slow chunks that fell into the past with a silent crash. She watched the pendulum swing. Tick. The brass disc caught the lantern light. Tock. It vanished into the shadow. The rhythm was soothing, a metronome for the waiting. But the waiting was active. It was a vigil. She realized she had not checked the power room. The thought arrived slowly, filtering through the haze of fatigue and cold. The batteries, the heart of the exchange. The banks of lead and acid that stored the energy to ring the bells and carry the voices were housed in the annex, a small, uninsulated addition off the back of the main room. If the temperature dropped too low, the chemical reaction would slow. The voltage would drop. The voices would become faint, whispering ghosts that could not bridge the distance. She had to go. It was a duty, a ritual of the shift. She pushed herself up from the stool again. The movement was becoming harder. Her joints felt fused, the synovial fluid thick and sluggish. Her knees cracked loudly in the quiet room. She stood, swaying for a moment as her equilibrium adjusted to the vertical plane. The floorboards complained under her boots, creak, groan. The sound was intimate, the house speaking to her. She picked up the lantern from its hook. The wire handle squeaked. The flame jumped, casting wild, swinging shadows across the switchboard. The light moved with her, a mobile sphere of amber illumination that carved a tunnel through the blue-gray dark. She walked past the stove, feeling a brief, teasing brush of warmth on her skirt, and then moved toward the back of the room. The shadows of the coat rack and the filing cabinet rotated as she passed, turning to watch her. The door to the battery room was a simple plank construction, painted the same dark green as the wainscoting. It had no latch, just a heavy iron handle. She gripped it. The metal was biting cold. She pulled. The door stuck for a moment, swollen by the dampness or frozen by the draft, then gave way with a shudder. She stepped across the threshold. The air in the battery room was different. It was colder, if that was possible, sharper and crystalline. But it also carried a scent that was distinct and industrial, the smell of sulfuric acid. It was a sour, metallic tang that prickled the nose and tasted of copper on the tongue. It was the smell of stored energy. The lantern light spilled into the room, revealing the rows of wooden racks lining the walls. On the racks sat the cells, dozens of them. They were large, rectangular glass jars, heavy and thick-walled. Inside each jar was a clear liquid, the electrolyte, and suspended within that liquid were the plates. Gray lead and brown lead dioxide. They looked like ancient tablets submerged in a preservative fluid. They were silent, motionless, yet they were alive with chemistry. They were trading ions in the dark, holding the potential for speech, for alarm, for connection. The operator held the lantern high. The light caught the curves of the glass jars, creating a series of warped, gleaming reflections that stretched down the line like a row of spectral eyes. The liquid inside was still, but if she looked closely, she could see tiny bubbles rising from the plates. Bloop, bloop, the slow effervescence of the charging current coming from the rectifier. She walked down the narrow aisle between the racks. The floor here was concrete, not wood. The cold came up through the soles of her boots with a brutal intensity. It felt as if she were standing on a block of ice. Her breath plumed before her, a thick white fog that swirled around the glass jars before dissipating. She reached the end of the rack where the pilot cell sat. This was the reference cell, the one used to gauge the health of the entire bank. Beside it lay the hydrometer, a glass syringe with a rubber bulb and a weighted float inside. She set the lantern on a small shelf, the light casting long, harsh shadows of the jars against the back wall. The shadows looked like a city skyline in the distance, a row of dark monoliths. She picked up the hydrometer. The glass was freezing. It felt fragile in her numb hand. She squeezed the rubber bulb. Wheeze. The sound was loud in the small, acoustic chamber of the room. She lowered the rubber tube into the electrolyte of the pilot cell. She released the bulb. The liquid rushed up into the glass tube. It was clear, slightly oily. Inside, the weighted float bobbed and spun, then settled. She leaned in, squinting in the dim lantern light to read the scale on the stem of the float. The meniscus of the acid cut across the numbers. 1.215. Specific gravity. It was within the acceptable range, but on the low side. The cold was affecting the efficiency. The chemical sluggishness mirrored her own. The electrons were moving slower, fighting the thermal drop just as she was. She squeezed the bulb again, expelling the acid back into the jar. Sploosh. The liquid turbulated, bubbles swirling, then settled back into stillness. She placed the hydrometer back on the shelf. The glass clinked against the wood. She stood there for a moment, surrounded by the silent power. The hum of the rectifier on the wall was a low, steady vibration, different from the singing of the wires. This was a mechanical hum, a 120-cycle buzz of AC being converted to DC. It was the sound of the grid feeding the exchange. As long as that hum continued, the batteries would charge. If the power lines went down, then the batteries would begin to drain. Slowly, inevitably, the voltage would drop until the voices faded into nothingness. She looked at the rows of jars. They were beautiful in a stark, utilitarian way. They were the reservoirs of human communication. Every "I love you," every "help me," every goodbye that passed through the switchboard drew a tiny sip of energy from these lead plates. They were the silent fuel of the valley's social life. Now they were fueling only the static and the wind. She shivered. The cold in this concrete room was aggressive. It was seeking the heat in her core. She grabbed the lantern. The handle was still cold. She turned back toward the door. The shadows swung again, the glass jars flashing with reflected firelight as she passed. She stepped back into the main room and pulled the door shut. Thud. The sound was heavy, sealing the acid smell and the chemical silence back in the annex. The main room felt deceptively warmer by comparison, though the thermometer would likely deny it. The smell of the coal fire was welcoming after the sharp tang of the acid. She walked back to the switchboard, the lantern swinging by her side. She hung it back on its hook. The circle of light stabilized, returning the room to its familiar chiaroscuro. She sat on the stool. The wood was still warm from her previous sitting. It was a small mercy. She adjusted her skirts, pulling the wool tight. She put the headset back on. As they change. The ocean of static returned. It washed over her, a cleansing wave of noise. She closed her eyes and listened. Was it louder? Perhaps. The storm was not relenting. The wind outside was a constant physical pressure on the building. She could feel the walls flexing slightly, breathing in and out with the gusts. She reached for the logbook. 8:32 p.m. Checked batteries. Pilot cell SG 1.215. Room temp 42F. She wrote the numbers. The ink flowed and dried. The record was made. The duty was fulfilled. She looked at the window. The frost was evolving. The patterns were no longer flat, they had depth. The ice was building up on the inside of the glass now, growing in thick, feathery ridges. The lantern light caught the edges of the ice, creating a glittering, crystalline landscape that looked like a photograph of the moon. It was a hostile terrain. If she were to touch the glass, her skin would stick to it. It was a barrier of pure cold. The operator rested her chin in her hand, her elbow on the shelf of the switchboard. Her eyes traced the lines of the cords, the red fabric of the calling cords, the green fabric of the answering cords. They were faded, the colors muted by the low light and the years of use. They looked like gray ropes in this illumination. She found herself staring at the trouble cap on line 18. It was a small brass tombstone. She wondered about the wire. Was it still falling? Or had it settled into the snow? Was the ice continuing to accumulate on it, burying it deeper? Suddenly, a sound came through the headset. It was not a voice, it was not the wind. It was a tone, a high-pitched, oscillating whistle, wee-oo, wee-oo. She sat up straight, her hand hovering over the keys. It was singing. Crosstalk. Two wires somewhere out in the dark were touching. Not enough to ground out, but enough to share their signals. Or perhaps it was the wind vibrating the wires at a specific harmonic frequency, turning the entire line into a giant Aeolian harp. The sound rose and fell, ghostly and eerie. It sounded like a flute played by a breath of ice. It was sad. It was lonely. It was the sound of the infrastructure shivering. She did not touch the keys. There was nothing to do. There was no one to connect. It was just the storm talking to itself. She listened to the song. It was hypnotic. It merged with the ticking of the clock. Tick-wee-tock, ooh. It created a strange, syncopated rhythm, a lullaby for the freezing. She leaned back, letting the sound fill her head. It was better than the silence. It was better than the flat hum of the dead line. It was a variation. The wind outside gusted, a long, tearing sound. The whistling in the headset spiked in pitch, screaming for a moment before dropping back to a low moan. The connection between the wind and the wire was direct. The physical force was becoming an electrical signal. She imagined the poles swaying. She imagined the copper stretching. She imagined the ice cracking. She looked at the fire in the stove. Through the mica window, she could see a single tongue of blue flame licking up from the coal. It was a small, desperate thing. It was fighting for its life against the crushing weight of the black rocks and the cold air. She felt a kinship with that flame. She, too, was a small source of heat in a world of cold matter. She wrapped her hands around her own waist, hugging herself. She could feel her ribs through the corset. She could feel the slow beat of her heart. Thump, thump. It was slow. Everything was slowing down. The metabolic rate of the room was dropping. She looked at the pencil lying on the logbook. It hadn't moved. It was an object at rest. It would stay there for 1,000 years if no one touched it. The thought was comforting. The persistence of objects. The endurance of wood and brass and glass. They did not feel the cold. They just existed. She wished she could be like the switchboard, made of oak and bakelite, indifferent, just a conduit, but she was flesh, and the flesh was cold. She wiggled her toes. The sensation was dull, distant, like sending a telegram to a remote station and waiting for the acknowledgement. Stop. Toes check. Stop. Feeling low. Stop. The whistling in the headset faded, replaced by the steady wash of static. The crosstalk had ceased. The wires had separated or the wind had shifted. The song was over. She was alone again with the hiss. 8:40 p.m. The night stretched out before her, a vast, white desert of time. She had to cross it minute by minute. There were no shortcuts. There was only the ticking clock and the falling snow. She closed her eyes. She visualized the snow falling, flake by flake, covering the roof, covering the road, covering the world. It was a soft, silent blanket, a shroud. It was peaceful in a way, the peace of absolute stillness. But she could not accept the peace. She had to watch the lights. She had to listen for the voices. She opened her eyes. The board was dark, the lantern burned, the frost grew. And the operator waited. The pendulum of the wall clock sliced through the stagnant air of the room, dividing the silence into identical, measured portions of time. Tick. A second of existence, frozen and preserved. Tock. Another second, sliding away into the dark history of the evening. The rhythm was relentless, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to grow louder as the organic sounds of the world outside were muffled by the deepening snow. The operator sat at the center of this temporal dismantling, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the middle distance where the lantern light faded into the blue-gray obscurity of the shadows. The atmosphere in the exchange had taken on a viscosity, a heaviness that pressed against the eardrums and settled in the lungs. It was 8:45 p.m. The night was no longer young. It had matured into a deep, solid state of winter. The room was a study in stillness. To an observer, had there been one, the scene would have appeared as a tableau vivant, a drawing in colored pencil where the artist had pressed hard on the dark blues and blacks, leaving the operator as a pale, sketched figure in the center. The only movement was the slight rise and fall of her chest, hidden beneath the layers of wool, and the occasional, almost imperceptible tremor of the lantern flame as a draft navigated the labyrinth of the walls to find the burner. The visual texture of the room was grainy, the low light failing to resolve the fine details, leaving the edges of the furniture soft and indeterminate. The coat rack in the corner was a blur of dark gray. The filing cabinet was a rectangular shadow. The map on the wall was a vague, pale rectangle, its contour lines and town names lost in the gloom. She felt the cold as a geological force. It was not merely a temperature, it was a physical weight, a layer of sediment accumulating on her skin. It started at the floor, a pool of freezing air that had risen past her ankles, past her calves, and was now settling around her knees. Her boots, heavy leather with thick soles, felt like blocks of stone. She could no longer feel the individual toes inside them, only a dull, heavy sensation of presence. She tried to wiggle them, sending a command down the long neural pathways of her legs. The response was faint, a distant shifting of weight that felt miles away. The floorboards beneath her were radiating the temperature of the frozen earth, a chill that seeped up through the wood, through the leather, and into the bone. On the desk ledge of the switchboard to the right of the logbook, a small pencil sharpener was clamped to the wood. It was a mechanical device, a housing of black-painted metal containing a helical cutter operated by a small crank handle. It sat there, a silent machine waiting for a purpose. The operator looked at it. Then she looked at the pencil in her hand. The point was dull, flattened by the entries of the evening. The wood near the tip was stained with ink. It was a small imperfection in the order of the room, a dull point, a lack of precision. Slowly, with the deliberation of someone moving underwater, she reached out and inserted the pencil into the opening of the sharpener. The fit was snug. She gripped the pencil with her left hand, her fingers stiff and clumsy. With her right hand, she found the crank. The metal handle was freezing, sucking the heat from her thumb and forefinger. She began to turn. Grind, scritch, grind. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet room. It was a harsh, destructive sound, the steel blades shaving away the cedar wood. Grind, scritch. She felt the resistance of the wood through the handle, a tactile vibration that traveled up her arm. She turned the crank slowly, savoring the mechanical interaction. It was a task. It was a change in the state of matter. She was transforming the wood into shavings, revealing the graphite core. Grind, scritch, snap. A small sound. The lead had broken inside. She paused. She reversed the crank, pulled the pencil out. The tip was jagged, a splintered ruin of wood and graphite. She sighed, a soft exhalation that manifested as a faint white cloud. She blew on the tip of the pencil, clearing the dust. She inserted it again. Grind, scritch, grind. She turned the handle with more care this time, feeling the bite of the blades. The smell of the cedar rose from the machine. It was a sharp, resinous scent, the smell of a forest in summer, trapped in the wood and released by the blade. It mixed with the smell of the coal smoke and the kerosene, a complex bouquet of dry industrial aromas. She inhaled it deeply, letting the scent trigger a faint, fleeting memory of warmth, of trees that were green and pliable, not frozen statues in the dark. She pulled the pencil out. The point was perfect. A lethal, conical taper of yellow wood ending in a sharp black tip. It was a small victory, a restoration of order. She placed the pencil back on the logbook, aligning it perfectly with the spine. She brushed a few stray specks of wood dust from the ledge. They floated to the floor, tiny yellow flakes settling into the darkness. The activity had circulated a small amount of blood in her hands. She rubbed them together, the dry skin rasping. Swish, swish. The sound was like dry leaves. She tucked her hands back into the sleeves of her shawl, rebuilding the thermal seal. The static in the headset continued its monologue. S-H-H-H-H-H-H-H, crackle, hiss. It was the sound of the storm's friction. The snow was a granular, abrasive rubbing against the world. She closed her eyes and listened to the texture of the noise. It was not uniform. There were layers to it. A deep, rumbling bass layer of wind, a mid-range hiss of snow, a high-pitched, spitting crackle of electrical discharge. It was a chaotic choir. Suddenly, a light blinked. It was not a distress signal. It was not a frantic pulsing. It was a slow, rhythmic flash. On, off, on, off. Line 8, the train depot. The station was at the bottom of the valley, near the tracks that followed the river. It was a place of iron and steam, usually loud, usually busy. But tonight, she knew, it would be as silent as the exchange. She reached for the cord. The movement was fluid, automatic. She plugged into the jack. Operator. Her voice was low, a whisper in the cathedral of the storm. Evening, Sarah. It was Mr. Gable, the station master. His voice was weary, scratchy, sounding like it was coming through a layer of wool. Just doing a line check. It's getting quiet down here. The line is clear, Mr. Gable, she said. A lot of static, but clear. Yeah, the telegraph line is down. Went dead about 10 minutes ago. I can't reach the dispatcher in the city. I was hoping the voice line was still holding. It's holding, she said, for now. Any word from the north? The 905 freight. No word, she said. Line 18 is down. The logging camp is cut off. I haven't heard a train whistle all night. Figures, Gable sighed. The sound was a burst of static in her ear. The drifts are probably over the tracks in the cut. Nothing's moving tonight. I've got the stove going, but the wind is coming right through the siding. It's a cold one. It is, she agreed. Keep the stove hot. You too. It's just me and the cat down here. And the cat's asleep on the coal pile. If you hear anything, if anyone calls, let me know. I will. All right, good night, operator. Good night. She pulled the plug. The light went out. The connection was broken. The silence rushed back in to fill the void left by his voice. It was a heavier silence now. The confirmation that the telegraph was down added another layer to the isolation. The telegraph was the nervous system of the railroad, the fast, clicking language of commerce and travel. If it was dead, the trains were blind. The valley was now not just snowbound. It was electronically severed from the logic of schedules and transport. The 905 freight was a ghost train, somewhere out there in the white, stopped, cooling, being buried. She imagined the engine sitting on the tracks, the great black iron beast covered in snow. The fire in the firebox banking down, the steam pressure dropping. The engineer and fireman huddled in the cab, watching the gauge, watching the white wall in front of the headlight. They were static objects now, part of the landscape. The operator looked at the logbook. She picked up the freshly sharpened pencil. The point was needle sharp. 8:52 p.m. Depot reports telegraph down. No trains, line 8 clear. She wrote the words. The sharp point bit into the paper, leaving a thin, precise line of graphite. The P in PM was crisp. The act of writing with the sharp tool was satisfying. It felt like she was etching the history of the storm into stone. She set the pencil down. The wind gusted again, a long, mournful note that vibrated the window glass. Hoo-oo-you-um. The frost on the pane was now a thick, opaque carapace. She could see nothing of the outside. The lantern light reflected off the ice, creating a mirror that showed her only the distorted interior of the room. She saw herself in the reflection, a dark, hunched shape, a shadow wrapped in wool with a pale face and dark eyes. She looked like a specter haunting the machine. She felt a sudden, intense desire for tea, hot tea, boiling hot. The memory of the taste, the steam hitting her face, the warmth traveling down her esophagus to her stomach. It was a vivid, painful hallucination. She looked at the cup on the ledge. It was empty save for a brown stain at the bottom. The kettle was on the stove, she knew. It was sitting on the back of the cast iron top. But was it hot? The fire was low. The water was probably lukewarm. To get up, to walk to the stove, to check the kettle, to pour the water. It seemed like an impossible sequence of physical tasks. The energy required to move her mass against the gravity of the cold was too great. She decided to wait. She would wait until the next hour check. Then she would stoke the fire and pour the tea. It was a reward to be earned, a carrot to dangle in front of the donkey of endurance. She leaned her head back against the wall behind the stool. The wood was cold, but it supported her. She stared up at the ceiling. The planks were dark, stained by years of smoke. In the corners, she could see cobwebs. They were coated in dust, gray and delicate. They swayed in the draft. Even the spiders were asleep or frozen. The hum of the wires seemed to change pitch. It dropped a semitone, hum-mum, to hum-mum. The weight of the ice was increasing. The tension on the copper was rising. She wondered which line would go next. Would it be the doctor's line, the sheriff's? The trunk line to the city? It was a lottery of physics. The weakest insulator, the rot in the pole, the flaw in the wire. The storm would find the weakness. She felt a phantom sensation in her fingers, the memory of vibration. After years of operating, she often felt the board vibrating even when it wasn't. It was a neurological echo. She rubbed her thumb against the side of the switchboard shelf, seeking the stillness of the wood to counteract the phantom buzzing. The wood was dead still. The vibration was in her mind. She closed her eyes. The darkness was a relief. The strain of peering through the gloom, of watching the dark holes for a light, was exhausting. In the dark, she could see better. She could see the map of the valley in her mind. She traced the lines. Line 1 runs north to the mill. Line 2 runs east to the church. Line 3 runs south to the schoolhouse. She flew over the snowy landscape in her imagination, following the copper threads. They were thin black lines drawn on a white sheet of paper. She saw the farmhouse at the end of line 12. The Andersons, they were old. They would be in bed now under heavy quilts. The fire in their hearth would be banked. The phone hung on the wall in the kitchen, a black box with a crank. It was silent. She hoped it stayed silent. A call from line 12 at this hour would mean illness or a fall or a death. She saw the general store on line 5. Dark. windows boarded up, the phone sitting on the counter next to the jar of pickled eggs. She saw the world as a network of silence, a grid of potential tragedy that was currently asleep. Her head nodded forward, a micro-sleep, a lapse in consciousness that lasted perhaps a second. She jerked her head up, her heart fluttering. Panic. Had she missed a light? Had a shutter dropped? She scanned the board frantically. The grid was black. The lamps were dark. The trouble cap on line 18 was still in place. Nothing had changed. The room was the same. The lantern was the same. The clock was the same. Tick-tock. 8:58 p.m. She had not missed anything. She breathed out, the white cloud escaping her lips again. The adrenaline faded, leaving her colder than before. The sleep was stalking her. It was a predator in the room, waiting for the fire to die down, waiting for her focus to slip. The cold was its ally. The cold made the sleep inviting. It whispered that it would be warm if she just closed her eyes. It promised that the shivering would stop. She shook her head, a violent motion to rattle the brain. "No," she whispered. "Not yet." She reached for the water pitcher on the floor. It was a ceramic jug. She poured a small amount into the cold cup. The water was freezing. She drank it. It was a shock to the system. It tasted of earth and stone. It woke her up. The cold in her stomach was an alert signal. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. The wool of the shawl scratched her lip. She looked at the window again. The frost had formed a new layer. There were ridges now, physical topography on the glass. The ice was invading the room. She imagined it growing across the floor, covering the switchboard, encasing her in a block of clear crystal. She would be preserved there, the operator at her post, the last voice in the storm, frozen in time. The wind moaned, a long, rising vowel sound. Ooh-whoa. It was the sound of the valley breathing. It was the sound of the air moving over the mountains, rushing down the slopes, squeezing through the passes. It was a vast, indifferent energy. She checked the thermometer on the pillar. She had to squint. The red line had dropped again. 40 degrees. The room was 8 degrees above freezing. The batteries in the annex would be colder. The efficiency was dropping. The time was running out. She looked at the stove. The red eye was almost closed. The ash had built up again. The cycle required maintenance. 9 o'clock, she said to herself. At 9 o'clock I will fix the fire. She watched the minute hand. It was a black bar against the white face. It moved. It touched the XII. Bong, the clock struck. The sound was flat, deadened by the cold air. Bong 2, bong 3. She counted them. 9 strikes. 9 tolls of the bell. The sound waves traveled through the room, bouncing off the frozen window, absorbed by the wool and the wood. It was 9:00 p.m., the heart of the night, the deepest part of the watch. She did not move immediately. She let the sound of the bell fade. She let the silence return. She wanted to hold the moment of transition. Then she placed her hands on the edge of the board. She took a breath. She prepared to stand. The fire was waiting. The coal was waiting. The cold was waiting. She was the keeper of the flame and the keeper of the wire, and she had hours left to go. The vibrations of the clock's 9th strike faded into the woodwork, absorbed by the frozen pores of the pine and the heavy velvet of the curtains that hung uselessly by the door. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a dense, pressurized container filled with the accumulation of the night's cold. The operator stood by the switchboard, her hand resting on the wooden shelf, her fingers pale and stiff like tapered candles. The transition from the seated position to the vertical had been a mechanical negotiation with her own anatomy. Her knees felt fused, the ligaments tight and brittle, snapping with soft, dry sounds as she straightened her legs. The blood, which had pooled in her feet, began a sluggish ascent against gravity, bringing with it a prickly, stinging sensation that was the only evidence of life in her lower extremities. She took a step. The sound of her boot heel striking the floorboard was dull and flat. Thud. It was the sound of a heavy object impacting a frozen surface. There was no resonance, no echo. The cold air dampening the acoustics of the room, stripping the sound waves of their energy before they could travel far. She moved towards the stove, navigating the blue-gray gloom that lay between the lantern's circle of light and the iron heater. The shadows in this interstitial space were thick and granular, swirling around her ankles like dark water. The air here was colder than near the board, a drafty corridor where the wind's breath seeped through the walls. She reached the stove and stood before it, a supplicant at a failing altar. The cast iron was black and sullen. The mica window revealed a bed of coals that had burned down to a deep, resonant crimson, covered by a thick blanket of gray ash that looked like dirty snow. The heat output was minimal. She could feel the cold radiating from the metal itself, a paradoxical sensation where the source of warmth felt like a block of ice until she got within inches of it. She reached for the shaker handle. The iron was biting cold. She wrapped her apron around her hand, a layer of cotton between her skin and the thermal shock. Rattle, clank, grind. She worked the handle back and forth. The sound was violent in the quiet room, a mechanical coughing of the stove clearing its throat. Inside, the ash fell through the grate into the pan below, raising a small cloud of dust that escaped through the vents. The dust smelled of sulfur and ancient, burned earth. It tasted dry on her tongue. As the ash cleared, the red glow in the window brightened, shifting from a dull cherry to a brighter, more urgent orange. The fire was breathing again. She picked up the coal scuttle. It was lighter now, the supply dwindling. She tilted it, listening to the slide of the anthracite, hiss, clatter, thump. The black stones fell into the firebox, banking the coals, smothering the light for a moment before they began to absorb the heat. She added 3 scoops, a precise ration, enough to last the hour, not enough to be wasteful. The coal was finite. The night was not. She set the scuttle down and picked up the kettle that sat on the back of the stove top. It was a heavy, enameled steel vessel, chipped in places to reveal the black iron beneath. She gave it a shake. It sloshed heavily. There was water in it, but it had been sitting in the cool zone. She slid it forward directly over the firebox onto the hottest part of the iron plate. Scrape. The metal-on-metal sound was harsh. She wanted tea. She needed the physical intrusion of heat into her body. The water in the cup earlier had been a shock. She needed a balm. She stood by the stove, waiting. It was a passive activity, but it required energy to remain standing. She leaned against the wall, feeling the cold seep through her shawl, through her blouse to her shoulder blade. The wall was freezing. It felt thin, as if only a sheet of paper separated her from the blizzard. She could hear the wind clearly here. It was rubbing against the siding, a friction sound like sandpaper on wood. Shhhshhshhshh. It was sanding the house down, eroding the shelter. She watched the kettle. Minutes passed. The lethargy of the room extended to the physics of boiling water. The heat transfer seemed agonizingly slow. She watched the spout. Finally, a wisp of steam appeared. It was a thin, white thread that rose straight up for an inch before curling into a chaotic arabesque and vanishing. Then another. Then a steady stream. The kettle began to sing. A low, rising whistle. Wee-yee. The sound was comforting. It was a domestic sound, a sound of kitchens and breakfasts and safety. It clashed with the industrial gloom of the exchange, but she welcomed the dissonance. She reached for her cup, which she had brought with her. She placed a pinch of tea leaves into the bottom, black, curled fragments of dried vegetation from a place that knew the sun. She lifted the kettle. The handle was warm. She poured. The water was dark as it hit the leaves, turning an amber brown instantly. The steam billowed up, a warm, moist cloud that hit her face. She closed her eyes and inhaled. The smell of the wet tea leaves was earthy and sharp. It smelled of tannins and life. For a second, the room dissolved. The cold receded. She was just a person holding a cup of tea. She opened her eyes. The steam was condensing on her eyelashes, freezing almost instantly into tiny droplets of ice. The reality of the room reasserted itself. She took a sip. The liquid was scalding hot. It burned her lip, burned her tongue, and burned a path down her throat. It was a magnificent pain. It was heat. She felt it radiate outward from her stomach, a small, internal sun trying to push back the encroaching winter. She walked back to the switchboard, cradling the cup in both hands, using it as a hand warmer. The ceramic was hot, transferring its energy to her numb palms. She sat down on the stool, the wood creaking a familiar welcome. She placed the cup on the ledge, watching the steam rise and drift to the left, caught in the draft from the window. The window was a source of fascination and dread. The frost on the inside was now a thick structural element. It had grown in ridges and valleys, building out from the glass like a coral reef. The lantern light caught the edges of the ice formations, making them glow with a dull, internal luminescence. It was no longer transparent. It was translucent, diffusing the darkness outside into a milky, gray void. The wind battered against it, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like a fist wrapped in a heavy blanket. Thump, thump. She put the headset back on. The receiver was cold against her ear, a shock after the warmth of the tea. The static greeted her. Hiss. It was louder now. The storm was intensifying. The density of the snow in the air was increasing the triboelectric charge. The wires were screaming. She picked up the pencil. She opened the logbook. 9:12 p.m. Stove stoked. Kettle boiled. Static severe on all lines. Temp 39 F. She wrote the temperature. It had dropped another degree. The room was sliding toward freezing. The walls were losing the battle. As she finished the entry, a light flashed. Second row, fourth column, the sheriff's office. It was a sharp, demanding blink. On, off, on, off. She felt a spike of adrenaline. The sheriff rarely called this late unless there was trouble. Real trouble, accidents, fires, freezing travelers. She plugged in. Her hand was steady, warmed by the tea. Slide, click. She flipped the listening key. Operator. Sarah, can you hear me? The voice was loud, booming, but fragmented by the static. It was Sheriff Miller. He sounded out of breath, as if he had been running. I can hear you, Sheriff. The line is noisy. It's a mess out here, he shouted, his voice cracking over the wire. Listen, I need you to ring the depot. I can't get through on the direct line. The telegraph is dead. The depot line is clear, but Mr. Gable said the telegraph was down an hour ago. What do you need? I need to know if the plow made it to the junction. We've got a car off the road near the bridge. The drift is 6 feet deep. We can't get to them with the truck. We need the plow to break the road from the south. One moment, I'll try the depot. She kept the sheriff on the line. She took the other cord, the calling cord, and plugged it into the depot jack. She turned the crank. Whirr ZZT, whirr ZZT. She waited, the static roared. "Hello," a weary voice, "Mr. Gable." "Mr. Gable, I have the sheriff on the line. He needs to know about the plow. Emergency near the bridge." "Put him through," Gable said. She flipped the key, bridging the connection. She could hear them both now, their voices meeting in the circuitry of the board. "Gable, this is Miller. Did the plow make the junction?" "Sheriff," Gable's voice was faint. "No, nothing. The tracks are buried. The 905 never showed. I haven't seen a plow since noon." "Damn it," the sheriff swore. The static surged, swallowing the curse. "We can't get the truck through. The snow is like concrete. If the plow isn't coming, those folks in the car are on their own." "It's bad, Sheriff," Gable said. "The drifts are over the windows here. I think the line to the city is going to go soon. I can hear the wire singing." "All right," Miller said. His voice was resigned. "We'll try to get the horses, but I don't know if they can handle this wind. Thanks, Gable." "Good luck, Sheriff." "Sarah," the sheriff's voice addressed her again. "I'm here. If you get any calls from the bridge area, line 14, tell them help is trying to get there, but tell them to stay inside. Do not leave the car. Do not try to walk. You understand?" "I understand. Stay inside. Do not walk." "Right, and Sarah, keep that stove hot. It's dropping fast out here. My thermometer says 10 below zero." "I will. Be careful, Sheriff." "Yeah, out." Click, the sheriff hung up. Click, Gable hung up. The two lights on the supervisory panel glowed. She pulled the plugs. The board went dark. The conversation was over. The drama played out in the dark, mediated by her hands, was finished. The result was silence, and a car buried in the snow near the bridge. She looked at the jack for line 14, the bridge road. It was silent, no light, no signal. The people in the car, if they were still able to reach a phone, weren't calling. Or maybe there was no phone near them, just the white darkness and the wind. She took a sip of her tea. It was lukewarm now. The heat had fled into the air. She drank it anyway. It was fluid. She picked up the pencil. 9:18 p.m. Sheriff to depot. Plow connection failed. Car off road near bridge. Line 14 area. Emergency. She wrote it down. The ink looked like black blood on the yellow paper, a record of a tragedy in progress. She sat back, the weight of the call settling on her shoulders. The isolation was absolute. The plow was not coming. The truck could not get through. The horses were the last resort. It was 1928, but the storm had pushed them back to the 1800s. Technology had failed. The internal combustion engine was useless. The telegraph was dead. Only the copper wire and the voice remained, and even those were fraying. The wind gusted, a long, mournful howl that shook the floorboards. The lantern swayed violently. The shadows leaped. She felt a sudden draft of freezing air hit the back of her neck. She turned. The heavy velvet curtain by the door was billowing inward, pushed by the pressure of the air leaking through the frame. The snow was trying to get in. She stood up. She had to check the door. She walked to the entrance. The floor near the door was covered in a fine white powder. Snow. It had been forced through the microscopic gaps in the wood, sifted like flour onto the dark floorboards. She touched the door handle. It was frozen solid. Ice had formed on the inside of the latch. She grabbed a rag from the hook on the wall, an old piece of flannel used for dusting. She stuffed it into the crack at the bottom of the door, jamming it tight with the toe of her boot. It was a pathetic barrier against the force of the blizzard, but it was something. She pushed the velvet curtain back against the frame. smoothing the heavy fabric. It was cold and damp to the touch. She returned to the stool. The excursion to the door had chilled her again. The tea's warmth was a distant memory. She wrapped the shawl tighter, pulling it up over her head again, creating the hood. She felt like a monk in a frozen monastery, dedicated to the worship of the wire. She stared at the board, the static hissed, the hum droned. She began to count the jacks again, to keep the mind focused. 1, 2, 3, 4. She thought of the people in the car. Were they cold? They must be terrified, the wind rocking the vehicle, the snow piling up over the windows, sealing them in darkness, the engine dead, the heat fading. They were waiting for a light that wasn't coming. She was waiting too. 25, 26, 27. The numbers were abstract, clean. They didn't feel cold. She looked at the lantern. The oil level was dropping. It was at the halfway mark now. It would last the night, but she would have to turn the wick down soon to conserve it, to dim the light, to invite the shadows closer. She reached out and turned the small brass wheel on the burner. The flame shrank. The orange light became deeper, more red. The corners of the room vanished into total blackness. The circle of light was now just the switchboard in her hands. The visual world was reducing. The auditory world was expanding. The sounds of the house were louder. The settling of the wood, the ticking of the clock, the scratching of the mice in the walls. No, even the mice were quiet tonight, too cold for them. It was just her and the wind and the static. She closed her eyes. She imagined the wire running to the bridge. She tried to send a mental signal down the line. Hold on, hold on. The horses are coming. But she knew the wire couldn't carry thoughts, only voltage, and the voltage was weak. She opened her eyes. The room was a cave. The frost on the window was a wall of diamonds. 9:30 p.m. The half hour struck on the clock, one single solitary bong. It was a lonely sound, the sound of a bell buoy in a fog. She picked up the pencil and tapped it against the logbook. Tap, tap, tap. I am here, she whispered. The static answered, hiss, crackle, pop. The snow continued to fall, burying the valley, burying the road, burying the wires. The world was being erased, turning white and silent. And she was the last witness, scratching ink onto paper in the dark. The reduction of the lantern flame had altered the fundamental physics of the room. By turning the brass wheel and lowering the wick, the operator had not merely dimmed the light. She had ceded territory to the darkness. The shadows, which had been respectful observers at the periphery of the room, now surged forward, claiming the filing cabinet, the coat rack, and the battery room door. They pooled on the floor like rising floodwater, swallowing the details of the wood grain and the dust, leaving only the immediate radius of the switchboard as a known quantity. The light that remained was a deep, bruised orange, a color that offered no cheer, only visibility. It cast the operator's hands in a spectral, reddish hue, making them look like wax sculptures detached from a living body. The temperature continued its inexorable descent. The thermometer, now lost in the gloom of the pillar, was irrelevant. The body knew the temperature. The cold had bypassed the sensory nerves of the skin and was now registering in the deep tissues, in the joints, in the heavy, sluggish beat of the heart. The operator sat inside a column of freezing air that seemed to descend directly from the ceiling, a heavy, invisible drapery that wrapped around her shoulders and weighed her down. The wool of her shawl, once a fortress, now felt like a sieve. The cold moved through the weave, finding the gaps between the fibers, touching the blouse beneath, touching the skin. She sat with her hands tucked deep into the opposite sleeves of the shawl, creating a closed loop of body heat. Her fingers were curled into fists, seeking the warmth of her own palms. The sensation was distant, as if she were holding someone else's hands. The numbness was a mercy in some ways. It dulled the sharp bite of the air, replacing it with a heavy, wooden lack of feeling. But it was also a danger. If she lost the dexterity of her fingers, she lost the board. She lost the ability to manipulate the plugs, to flip the keys, to be the interface between the storm and the valley. She flexed her fingers inside the wool. Open, close, open, close. The movement was slow, grinding. The tendons felt like frozen ropes sliding through rusty pulleys. She focused on the sensation of her wedding ring, a simple gold band on her left hand. The metal was cold against her skin, a ring of ice that burned slightly. It was a tactile anchor, a circle of order in the chaos. The sound of the wind had evolved again. It had lost the rhythmic pulsing of the earlier evening and had settled into a constant, high-velocity scream. It was a monotone roar, a sheer wall of sound that battered the north face of the building without pause. The timber frame of the exchange was under immense stress. She could hear the wood complaining, sharp cracks and deep groans that echoed through the room like gunshots in a canyon. The nails were pulling in the freezing wood. The joints were shifting. The building was huddling in on itself, trying to present a smaller target to the gale. She looked at the window. The frost on the inside was no longer just a surface coating, it was a structural accumulation. The ice had built up into a thick, opaque carapace, inches deep in the corners. It encroached on the glass, narrowing the aperture of the window, sealing the room into a tomb of ice. The lantern light reflected off the faceted surface of the frost, creating a glittering, cavernous effect. It looked like the inside of a geode, a hollow rock lined with crystals, beautiful and dead. She could see nothing of the outside world. The blizzard was an abstract concept now, a force that existed only as sound and pressure. The static in the headset was the only connection to the exterior. It was a roaring ocean of white noise. Shh crackle pop shh. The volume had increased as the storm intensified. The snow, driven by the wind, was generating massive amounts of static electricity. The wires were antennas, harvesting the energy of the blizzard and pouring it into her ear. It was a deafening, chaotic sound, but she did not turn it down. She needed it. It was the sound of the lines holding. If the static stopped, it meant the line was dead. Silence was the enemy. Noise was life. She closed her eyes, letting the visual world fade into the red-black of her eyelids. She drifted on the waves of static. In the random noise, her mind began to construct patterns. This was the danger of the deep shift, the auditory pareidolia. She heard voices in the hiss, faint, whispering voices. They sounded like people talking in a distant room or a radio left on in another house. She heard a baby crying. She heard a dog barking. She heard her own name being called. Sarah, Sarah. She snapped her eyes open. The room was empty. The shadows were still. The lantern burned its low, sullen flame. "I am here," she said aloud. Her voice was a croak, dry and unused. "I am awake." She reached for the water cup. It was empty. The tea was gone. The thirst was a dry patch in the back of her throat. She looked at the kettle on the stove. It was silent now. The fire had likely burned down again. The cycle of maintenance was due, but the effort, the gravity, it was too much. Not yet. She would wait until the clock struck the quarter hour. She looked at the logbook. The last entry was 9:18 p.m. Emergency. The page was a pale rectangle in the dark, The ink was dry. The history was set. Suddenly the board came alive. Not a light, but a sound. A buzzing, a mechanical vibration of the armature behind the signal lamp of line 14, the bridge road. The light didn't fully catch. It flickered, a weak, sputtering glow that struggled to illuminate the glass cap. BZZZT. Blink. BZZZT. It was a high-resistance signal. The current was weak. The line was partially grounded, or the phone on the other end was damaged, or the person turning the crank was too weak to generate the full voltage. She pulled her hand from the warmth of the shawl. The air bit her skin instantly. She grabbed the plug. It felt like an icicle. She jammed it into the jack. Operator. Static, heavy, rolling waves of it. And beneath it, a sound that chilled her blood more than the air. Breathing, ragged, wet breathing, and the sound of wind. Not wind outside a house, but wind inside the microphone. "Hello," she said, pressing the receiver to her head. "Is someone there?" "Help." The voice was a whisper, a woman's voice. High-pitched, terrified, it sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "I can hear you," Sarah said. Her voice became the professional anchor. "Where are you?" "The car," the glass broke. "The snow." It was the car near the bridge. The one the sheriff had been looking for. They had a portable set. No, that was impossible. They must have reached a pole box, or maybe they had crashed near a line and... No, they must have reached the farmhouse, the weaver's house. But the voice, it sounded like it was outside. "Are you in the car?" Sarah asked. "Or are you at a house?" "Car, cold, so cold, Henry won't wake up." The woman was delirious. The hypothermia was setting in. She was speaking in fragments. "Listen to me," Sarah said, her voice firm, cutting through the static. "You must cover up. Use the blankets. Huddle together. The sheriff knows you are there. Help is trying to reach you." "The light," the woman whispered. "I saw a light in the trees." "Is it a house?" "Don't know, just white. Everything is white." "Keep talking to me," Sarah said. "Don't go to sleep. Tell me your name." Ilara Vance." "Ilara, that's a pretty name. Listen to me, Ilara. You have to stay awake. Rub your hands together, move your feet. Can you move your feet?" "Can't feel them. Heavy, like wood." "Move them anyway. Wiggle your toes, do it now." There was a long pause. The static roared. The wind howled in the receiver. It sounded like the woman was holding the phone in the middle of a field. "Ilara." "Tired, Sarah, so tired." "No, do not sleep. Ilara, stay with me." "The light is getting closer, warm." "That is not a light, Ilara. That is the cold. Do not go to the light. Stay here. Stay with my voice." "Your voice is nice, like summer." "Think about summer," Sarah said, desperation creeping into her tone. "Think about the sun. Think about hot tea, but stay awake to drink it." "Henry is cold. He's ice." The connection began to degrade. The static spiked, tearing holes in the woman's voice. Crackle, pop, woo-whoosh. "Ilara, can you hear me?" "Snow covering us." "Ilara." Click. The line went dead. Not the click of a receiver being hung up, but the sharp, final snap of a wire breaking. The hum vanished. The static changed tone, becoming the flat, empty hiss of an open circuit. Sarah sat frozen, her hand still gripping the plug. She stared at the dark lamp. The connection was gone. The wire had snapped, or the pole had fallen, or the cold had simply overwhelmed the physics of the transmission. She pulled the plug slowly. The brass tip was dark. She sat in the silence for a moment, the sound of the woman's fading voice echoing in her memory. So tired. She picked up the pencil. Her hand was shaking, not from the cold but from the adrenaline crash. 9:42 p.m. Line 14. Contact with car occupants. Ilara Vance, hypothermic, connection lost, line dead. She wrote the entry. It felt like writing an obituary. There was nothing she could do. She couldn't leave the board. She couldn't walk to the bridge in this storm. She was the witness, the scribe of the disaster. She looked at the stove. The anger flared in her, the helpless rage against the storm. She needed to do something. She needed to fight back. She stood up. She marched to the stove. She grabbed the poker. She stabbed the fire, crunch, smash. She broke the clinkers. She stirred the coals violently, sending sparks flying up the chimney. She grabbed the coal scuttle. She didn't ration it this time. She poured a heavy stream of anthracite into the maw of the heater. "Burn," she whispered. "Damn you, burn." She slammed the door shut. She opened the damper wide. She wanted the stove to roar. She wanted to hear the iron expand. She wanted to feel the heat push back the death in the room. She stood there, breathing heavily, watching the orange glow return to the mica window. It brightened. The stove began to rumble. Huyumum. It was a good sound, an aggressive sound. She turned back to the room. The lantern seemed dimmer than ever. The shadows were unimpressed by her display of defiance. They still held the corners. The frost still held the window. She walked back to the stool. She sat down. She put the headset back on. The static was there. The survivor, the constant. She looked at the clock. 9:48 p.m. The night was endless. The time between minutes was stretching out, becoming vast plains of waiting. She felt the fatigue pulling at her eyelids again. The emotional weight of the call added to the physical exhaustion. It was a heavy burden to carry alone in the dark. She thought of Henry, the man who was ice. He was likely gone, and Ilara, waiting in the dark car, buried in snow, holding a dead phone. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. She rocked slightly back and forth. It was a self-soothing motion, a primitive rhythm. "I am here, I am watching, I am listening." She repeated the mantra in her head. It was the only thing keeping her anchored to the chair. She looked at the map on the wall, the faint outline of the bridge road. It was just a line of ink on paper, but out there it was a place of tragedy. The wind gusted, shaking the entire building. The floorboards jumped. The lantern swung so hard it almost hit the wall. The shadows spun dizzily. "Blow then," she whispered to the wind. "Blow until you're empty." The wind ignored her. It continued its assault. She felt a numbness in her feet that was concerning. It was no longer a cold sensation. It was an absence of sensation. She stamped her boots on the floor. Thud, thud, no feeling. Just the impact traveling up her shins. She needed to move them more. She extended her legs, rotating her ankles. She could feel the stiffness in the joints, but the toes were silent. She looked at the battery room door. Was the cold in there affecting the cells? The voltage on the call had been low. Was that the line or the batteries? She should check again. But the thought of opening that door, of stepping into that acid-smelling icebox, she couldn't do it. Not yet. She would trust the chemistry a little longer. She focused on the pencil sharpener, the black metal housing, the little crank. It was a machine. It didn't care about the cold. It just sharpened pencils. She wished she were a pencil sharpener. She looked at the logbook again. The name Ilara Vance stood out. She wondered who she was. A traveler, a local. Why were they out in this? A family emergency, a foolish errand. It didn't matter now. The storm didn't judge motives. It only judged thermal insulation. The static in the headset seemed to change texture. It became sharper, more brittle. The snow was turning to ice pellets, sleet. She could hear it hitting the window now. Tick, 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 tick. A harder, faster sound than the snow. The ice was glazing the building. The weight on the lines would increase dramatically. The sleek, wet ice would coat the copper, turning the wires into heavy glass rods. They would snap, she knew it. It was only a matter of time. The network was going to collapse. She looked at the rows of jacks. They looked like the windows of a dark apartment building. Hundreds of darkened rooms. "Don't call," she whispered. "Stay inside, stay warm, don't call me." She didn't want to hear another voice die. She didn't want to document another end. She wanted the board to stay dark until morning. But she kept her eyes on the lamps. That was the job, to watch the darkness and wait for the light. 9:55 p.m. 5 minutes to 10. The hour was turning again. Another block of time survived. She prepared herself for the strike of the clock. She knew what it would sound like. The wheeze, the click, the hollow bong. It was the soundtrack of her confinement. She reached for the pencil. She needed to hold it. It was a weapon, a spear to fend off the sleep. She gripped it tight, feeling the ridges of the wood press into her numb fingers. She watched the minute hand. It crept forward. It seemed to struggle against the viscosity of the air. Tick-tock. The sound was loud, like a hammer on an anvil. She took a deep breath. The air was dry, dusty, cold. Inhale, exhale. The white cloud appeared. It was thinner now. Her body heat was dropping. The furnace was cooling. She needed to eat something, to stoke the internal fire. She remembered she had a biscuit in her pocket, a hard, dry piece of bread wrapped in a handkerchief. She pulled it out. It was frozen, hard as a rock. She bit into it, crack. It threatened to break her tooth. She gnawed on it, letting her saliva soften the crumbs. It tasted of flour and pocket lint, but it was food. It was fuel. She ate it slowly, staring at the frost. The clock struck, bong 10 times. The sound filled the room, a mournful elegy for the hour that had passed. 10:00 p.m. The operator swallowed the last of the biscuit. She brushed the crumbs from her lap. She sat up straighter. She adjusted the headset. "I am here," she whispered. The static hissed its reply. The night moved on. The vibrations of the clock's 10th strike had long since decayed into the silence of the room, absorbed by the heavy curtains and the frost-laden timber. The air had settled back into its motionless, crystalline state, a medium so thick with cold that it felt as if the operator were sitting at the bottom of a deep, freezing ocean. The pressure was immense, not of water, but of the accumulated hours and the relentless, crushing weight of the storm. The darkness had achieved a physical density. It pressed against the small, shrinking sphere of lantern light, eroding its edges, pushing the shadows closer to the operator's boots. The room was no longer a defined space with walls and corners. It was a vague, nebulous pocket of existence suspended in a void of white noise and ice. The operator sat motionless on the stool. Her posture had become a permanent feature of the room, a sculpture of endurance carved from wool and exhaustion. She was no longer fighting the lethargy. She was inhabiting it. The line between her body and the environment had blurred. Her legs, numb and heavy, felt like extensions of the wooden legs of the stool. Her hands, resting on the cold shelf of the switchboard, felt like they were made of the same oak and varnish. She was part of the machine now, a biological component integrated into the circuit of copper and brass. The headset was her ear, the static was her pulse, and the wind was her breath. She stared at the switchboard. The grid of jacks was a wall of sleeping eyes. They were dark, indifferent, and silent. The earlier activity, the sheriff, the station master, the tragic whisper of Alara Vance, seemed like memories from a different century. They were echoes that had faded into the static, leaving no trace on the physical reality of the board. The trouble cap on line 18 was still there, a small brass monument to the first failure of the night. The other lines were ostensibly alive, but their silence was ambiguous. Were they holding, or had they snapped in the dark, falling into the snow without triggering a signal? The operator did not know. She could only watch the lamps and wait for a sign that might never come. The visual quality of the scene had degraded further. The lantern, its wick turned low to conserve the dwindling oil, cast a light that was little more than a smudge of burnt sienna against the charcoal gray of the surroundings. The details of the room were lost. The map on the wall was gone. The filing cabinet was a black monolith. The only things that existed were the illuminated patch of the switchboard and the frost on the window. The frost was magnificent. In the low light, it glowed with a ghostly internal luminescence. It had consumed the window entirely. There was no glass left to see, only a thick, rugged landscape of ice. It grew in layers, fern upon fern, feather upon feather, building a barrier that was inches thick. It was beautiful and terrifying. It was the storm manifesting inside the room. The operator watched the ice crystals glitter. They looked like the jewels of a cold, dead kingdom. She imagined the ice growing over her boots, creeping up her skirt, encasing her hands, freezing her to the spot. She would become a statue of ice, eternally listening to the static. She blinked. The movement of her eyelids was slow, a heavy shutter closing and opening on a camera lens. Her eyes were dry, gritty with fatigue. The strain of peering into the gloom had taken its toll. The headache behind her temples had settled into a dull, rhythmic throb that synchronized with the beating of her heart. Thump, thump, thump. It was a slow rhythm. Her metabolism had slowed down to match the temperature of the room. She was in a state of hibernation, awake but dormant, conserving every calorie of heat. She felt the draft from the floor. It was a constant, fluid presence. It wrapped around her ankles like a cold river. It seeped up through the cracks in the floorboards, carrying the scent of the frozen earth beneath the foundation. It smelled of wet stone and ancient dust. It was the smell of the basement, of the grave, of the deep winter. She wiggled her toes inside her boots. There was no sensation. They were gone, abstract concepts at the end of her legs. She accepted this. The cold was a thief, taking her body piece by piece. The sound of the wind was the dominant reality. It had ceased to be a variable force. It was now a constant state of the atmosphere. It roared with a monotonous white noise intensity that drowned out the creaking of the house. It was a wall of sound that enclosed the building. Inside the headset, the static mirrored the wind. Hiss. It was a seamless loop of noise. The operator listened to the texture of it. She heard the granular impact of the sleet on the wires. She heard the low-frequency hum of the ice load. She heard the phantom voices again, whispering in the chaos. They were not words, but fragments of sound that the brain tried to assemble into meaning. A laugh, a cry, a name, but there was no meaning. There was only the storm. She looked at the stove. The red eye in the mica window was barely visible. The aggressive stoking she had performed earlier had burned itself out. The coal had turned to ash. The heat had dissipated into the ravenous air. The stove was a cold iron box containing a dying memory of fire. She knew she should get up. She knew the routine: shake, pour, poke. But the will to move was gone. The distance to the stove felt like miles. The air between the stool and the heater was a solid block of ice she would have to tunnel through. She decided to let it be. Let the fire sleep. Let the cold come. The shawl was enough. The wool was enough. She pulled the shawl tighter, lifting it higher over her head until it formed a tunnel around her face. Inside the wool cave, the air was slightly warmer. It smelled of her own breath and the lanolin of the sheep. It was a primitive shelter. She breathed deeply, recycling the heat. Inhale. The wool pressed against her mouth. Exhale. The warmth reflected back. She closed her eyes. In the darkness of the hood, she was no longer in the exchange. She was floating in the static. She was a spark of electricity traveling down the wire. She was moving through the copper, passing the frozen poles, passing the buried fences, passing the dark houses. She saw the world from the perspective of the current. It was a world of resistance and conductivity. The ice was an insulator. The ground was a sink. The wind was interference. She flowed through the valley, checking the lines. She touched the house of the Andersons, silent. She touched the store, silent. She touched the bridge, broken. She touched the logging camp, dead. She was the ghost in the machine, haunting the copper web. She jerked awake. Her head had dropped, a micro-sleep. She opened her eyes, panic flaring for a second. Had she missed a light? She scanned the board. The darkness was absolute. No lamps, no signals. The board was a cliff face at night. She looked at the clock. The face was dim, barely readable. She squinted. 10:45 p.m. Time was dilating. The minutes were hours. The hours were eras. She had been sitting here since the beginning of the world. She would be sitting here until the end of it. There was no mourning. There was no relief. There was only the shift. She reached for the pencil. Her hand was a claw, stiff and clumsy. She grasped the wooden hexagon. It felt alien. She looked at the logbook. The page was a blur of blue lines. She needed to write something, to prove she was still the operator. 10:45 p.m. No signals, static continuous, wind unchanged. She wrote the words. The handwriting was jagged, the letters disconnected. It looked like the writing of a very old person or a child. The ink barely flowed. It was freezing in the pen. She set the pencil down. The sound of the wood hitting the desk was swallowed by the silence. She looked at the pencil sharpener again, the little black machine. It sat there, patient, ready to grind. It was the only thing in the room that made sense. It had a function, it performed it. It stopped. She envied the sharpener. It didn't have to wait, it didn't have to listen. The wind gusted, a massive, shuddering impact that made the floorboards jump beneath her feet. The lantern flame flickered wildly, nearly extinguishing. For a second, the room was plunged into total darkness. The operator held her breath. Stay lit, stay lit. The flame caught, flared blue, then settled back to its sullen orange. The shadows stabilized. The heart of the room started beating again. She let out the breath. A cloud of white mist, thick and heavy, rolled out from the hood of her shawl. It drifted across the switchboard, swirling around the cords, ghostly and silent. It looked like a spirit leaving the body. She watched it dissipate. She began to count the cords. The red ones, the green ones, the gray ones. They hung in their loops, motionless. They looked like vines in a frozen jungle. 1, 2, 3, 4. She imagined the voices that had traveled through those cords over the years. The news of the war, the news of the peace, the prices of wheat, The gossip of the town, the lovers, the doctors, the grieving, all those voices were gone, absorbed into the history of the wire. The cords were empty now, just braided cotton and rubber. The hum in the headset changed pitch again. Wee-oo-wee. The singing wire, it was back. A lonely, oscillating melody played by the storm. It was beautiful, sad and cold and beautiful. She hummed along with it, a low vibration in her throat that didn't form a note. M. She harmonized with the blizzard. She wondered about the car at the bridge, about Alara. Was she sleeping? Was the snow covering the windows? Was it warm in the car now? The operator hoped it was warm. She hoped the hypothermia had brought the final, gentle heat that comes before the end. She hoped Alara was dreaming of summer. "I am here," she whispered to the dead wire. "I am still here." She felt a strange kinship with the woman in the snow. They were both trapped. They were both waiting. They were both listening to the wind. One was inside, one was outside, but the difference was academic. The cold was the same. The night was the same. She looked at her hands. The skin was translucent, blue-veined. They looked like parchment. She rubbed them together. The sound was like dry paper. There was no friction, no heat. Her hands were just objects. She looked at the window. The frost had stopped growing. It had reached its maximum density. The room was sealed. There was no more moisture to freeze. The air was perfectly dry, perfectly still. She closed her eyes again. She visualized the snow falling outside. It was falling on the roof. Hush, 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 piling up, inch by inch, foot by foot, covering the shingles, covering the chimney, covering the wires. The building was becoming a hill of snow, a mound in the white landscape. Soon it would be indistinguishable from the drifts. Inside she was the kernel, the seed, the last spark of consciousness. She listened to the static. It was a river, a vast white river flowing through her head. It carried her away. She floated on the current. It was peaceful. The anxiety of the lights was fading. The worry about the fire was fading. The cold was no longer painful. It was just a state of being. She was the operator. She was the wire. She was the storm. Tick-tock. The clock marked the time, 10:55 p.m. The hour was ending. The cycle was closing. She didn't move to check the stove. She didn't move to check the door. She just sat. She let the silence fill her. She let the static wash over her. She waited for the light, any light, but there were no lights, only the dark, sleeping eyes of the board. The wind howled, a long, endless note that stretched across the night. The operator took a slow, shallow breath. She adjusted the headset. She watched the darkness. And the snow continued to fall. And the wires continued to sing. And the night went on and on and on.